Hello? Okay. Just before we begin, a reminder that emergency exits are out the back. There's placards and lights on the doors. Washrooms, there's a set down there and as well down at the other end of the hallway, just outside the room. Water is available in that back corner, and coffee and other refreshments outside the door. And we'll begin in a couple minutes here. Or even right now, sure.
Can I have my microphone on at the back? Okay. All right. Good morning and welcome. My name is Mark Jackard, chair of this panel, and with me on the panel are Commissioners Carol-Ann Brewer and Tom Losky. So welcome to today's New Energy Acquisition Workshop in the matter of BC Hydro's application for approval of its 2021 Integrated Resource Plan. This workshop is being transcribed and the audio portion is broadcast on the BCUC YouTube channel. Present today is the BCUC staff team led by Nicola Simon, who is project manager, and Phil Stallard, who is the lead staff. Lino Bisoli is our legal counsel. On June 13th, BC Hydro filed the signpost update to their 2021 IRP, which included update plans to accelerate or extend the timing of several of the existing near-term actions, acquire approximately 3,000 gigawatt hours of new clean or renewable energy from greenfield facilities in BC to achieve commercial operations starting in fiscal 2029, and approximately 700 gigawatt hours of new energy from existing facilities prior to 2029. The purpose of this workshop today is for BC Hydro to present information related to new energy acquisitions in more detail than the current evidentiary record, and for participants in the panel to ask clarifying questions on that information. This workshop is not an opportunity for cross-examination of BC Hydro presenters. They're all smiling. Mr. Bisoli, will you run through the logistics for today, and then BC Hydro can start its presentation. We plan to take a break mid-morning and mid-afternoon at the appropriate time, and we'll pause for a lunch break around noon. Over to you, Mr. Bisoli.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Just going to do a brief order of appearances so we'll begin with BC Hydro, so British Columbia Hydro and Power Authority.
Thank you. Good morning. Ian Webb, WEBB, appearing on behalf of BC Hydro this morning. I'll let the panel introduce themselves in due course.
Okay. In that case, we will move on to the next, which is Fortis BC Energy Inc. and Fortis BC Inc.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Nicholas Hoagie. Last name is spelled H-O-O-G-E. Appearing as counsel for Fortis BC Energy Inc. and Fortis BC Inc., collectively Fortis BC. Also attending the workshop this morning for Fortis BC are Sarah Commander, Regulatory Projects Manager, Jesse Scharf, Energy Supply Market Analyst, and Ryan Corbett, Manager, Energy Supply Project Development. Thank you.
Next is North River Midstream Inc.
David Bursey, counsel for North River Midstream. With me is Gurinder Pamar from North River and Chanel Sinclair from Harline.
Next is Clean Energy BC.
Good morning, everyone. Kwama Kwatuma Kosairs. I'm here on behalf of Clean Energy BC, and I think with us is Travis Lesney virtually. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is the Nachalnuth Tribal Council.
Good morning, David Austin, AUSTIN, on behalf of the Nachalnuth Tribal Council, and I have with me Mr. Jay Weimer, spelled W-E-I-M-E-R.
Next is Quadacha Nation and Seke Dene Nation and the Zone 2 Ratepayers Group. Sure. Could we go virtually to Mr. Ennis?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Sebastian Ennis, E-N-N-I-S, Council for Quadacha Nation and Seke Dene Nation, together referred to as the Zone 2 Ratepayers Group, and appearing in person as energy consultant Linda Dong, D-O-N-G.
Next is Association of Major Power Customers.
Thank you. Good morning. Matthew Keene, spelled K-E-E-N, appearing for AMSI, the Association of Major Power Customers of BC. With me is Michael Manhas, spelled M-A-N-H-A-S, and Melissa Davies, D-A-V-I-E-S. Oh, and virtually we have Patrick Madere, M-A-D-H-E-R-E. Oh, I'm sorry. Wrong Patrick. Patrick Bowman.
Close. Next is Residential Consumer Intervenor Association.
Hi, good morning. Matthew Matuziak, last name spelt M-A-T-U-S-I-A-K, on behalf of the Residential Consumers Intervenor Association, or RCIA for short. I'm here with my colleague Michael Walsh, last name spelt W-A-L-S-H. Thank you.
Next is the Commercial Energy Consumers Association of BC.
Good morning. Patrick Weafer, last name spelled W-E-A-F-E-R, counsel to the Commercial Energy Consumers Association of BC, and with me in the room is David Ince.
Next is British Columbia Old Age Pensioners Organization, Active Support Against Poverty, Disability Alliance BC, Council of Senior Citizens Organizations of BC, Tenants Resource and Advisory Center, and Together Against Poverty Society.
Good morning. Irina Miss, last name M-I-S, representing BC Old Age Pensioners Organization for all.
Next is BC Sustainable Energy Association and Vancouver Electric Vehicles Association, and I believe Mr. Andrews is virtual.
EREWS, representing the BC Sustainable Energy Association and the Vancouver Electric Vehicle Association. Also attending online is Tom Hackney, H-A-C-K-N-E-Y. Thank you.
Next is the BC First Nations Energy and Mining Council.
Good morning, Andrew McLaren, M-C-L-A-R-E-N, working with the BC First Nations Energy and Mining Council.
Next is Metro Vancouver.
Thank you. Richard Stout, S-T-O-U-T. With me is Nicole Chan of Metro Vancouver. We are advising a group of cities and districts, including Metro Vancouver, City of Vancouver, City of Richmond, District of North Vancouver, and the District of Saanich.
Next is the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers.
Good morning, Aurelio Zanni representing CAP today. Zanni, Z-A-N-N-I. Thank you.
Next is Kanaka Bar Indian Band and also Gitnyao Hereditary Chiefs. Is Steve or Scott Jansen here?
Online.
Oh, online, sorry. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm representing the Gitnyao Hereditary Chiefs and the Kanaka Bar Indian Band, Scott Jansen, professional engineer, electrical engineer.
Next is the BC Solar and Storage Industries Association.
Steve Davis, representing the BC Solar and Storage Industries Association. Davis, D-A-V-I-S.
And next is BC Community Solar Coalition. Cal Leem, are you online? No? Is there anybody I haven't called for appearances today that is, oh, sorry.
Matt Davis from Capital Power, D-A-V-I-S. Joining me is Jared Alexander.
Is there anybody else online or in attendance that needs to make an appearance that I haven't yet called? Hearing none, that concludes the order of appearances, Mr. Chair.
Okay, so now I hand it over to BC Hydro. Yeah. All right, Chris, please go ahead.
Good morning, everyone, and thanks very much for taking the time this morning to be here for this workshop. I want to start first by introducing myself and some of the individuals with me. My name's Chris Samvey. I'm BC Hydro's Chief Regulatory Officer, and I was involved in helping to manage the signposts update to the 2021 Integrated Resource Plan. To my immediate right is Sanjaya Dezoiza, Senior Manager of Resource Planning with our Energy Planning Group. And to his right is Frank Lynn, Director of Interconnections, and in that capacity, Frank is also managing the call for power process. Behind us, we have 4 individuals. Charlie Wheeler and Dina Matterson are with our Indigenous Relations group, and Mike Savidant and Alex Tu are with our Energy Planning Group. I want to start this morning by acknowledging that we are fortunate to be able to gather today on the unceded traditional territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. And one of the reasons that we're here today is to talk about clean energy projects. And so I want to talk in particular about one clean energy partnership with the Squamish First Nation who hold this traditional territory. Coolton Creek is a run-of-river hydroelectric facility with a nameplate capacity to generate 15 megawatts of clean, renewable electricity. It's located approximately 20 kilometers north of Squamish, was commissioned in 2016, and continues to provide power to approximately the equivalent of 5,900 homes today. The project was built by Blue Earth Renewables, Inc. as a result of an electricity purchase agreement with BC Hydro as part of the 2010 Clean Power Call. The construction of the project included employment and business opportunities for Squamish Nation members. It is in this spirit that BC Hydro hopes to move forward with clean energy projects in the upcoming call for power, as well as support Indigenous interests and advance reconciliation. I want to start this morning just by setting the scene a bit more for the signpost update and the new energy acquisition process. And I think there's a couple key themes to keep in mind today as we talk about kind of where we started and where we are now. The first is that we are in the midst of an energy transition here in British Columbia. As was talked about a lot last week, uncertainty about the pace and the timing of that transition, but I think many signs that transition is advancing, many signs that governments, customers are making decisions to move along that path. The second theme that I want to highlight here is just the passage of time. BC Hydro filed our original 2021 Integrated Resource Plan in December of 2021, almost 2 years ago. And if you include the process that was taken to develop that plan, close to 3-4 years in terms of start to finish development of the plan and review of the plan. And as Ms. Daschuk and others reflected on last week, if you think about all of the things that have happened over that period of time, the pandemic, again, continued momentum and advancement on policy front, customer decisions front in terms of movements on the energy transition, a lot has happened. And so that prompted BC Hydro, as all of you know, in June to file the signpost update to update our 2021 Integrated Resource Plan. And when we did that, we really focused on being ready for what we called the potential pace of change. And so we accelerated, extended our existing near-term actions. We added a new term action, which is the focus of today's workshop, and did all of that in the vein of really trying to say, how can we recognize that there's a range of potential futures, and how can we best position ourselves to be ready for the potential pace of change as we move towards that range of potential outcomes. So to summarize the signpost update, which I'm sure we'll get into in more detail today as we talk about the new energy acquisition process, signpost update said that when you compare the original 2021 IRP to the update in June of this year, there was a 4,000 gigawatt hour shift in the amount of energy that we needed to plan to bring forward when you looked at the reference load forecast and the base resource plan in fiscal 2030. So lots of changes and lots of ways of describing that change depending on your reference point, but using fiscal 2030 and the reference and the base plan as an anchor, 4,000 gigawatt hour shift. And so we looked at that 4,000 gigawatt hour shift. To break that down, about 2,200 gigawatt hours of that came from an update to the load forecast. 800 gigawatt hours of that came from our demand side management actions moving forward and now becoming part of the historical sales and no longer being an available resource, and the remaining 1,000 came from a shift in what we expected we could get from our existing and committed resources. We looked at that 4,000 gigawatt hour shift and said, okay, what do we think we need to do to be able to respond? And that's summarized here on this slide. We first looked, as I said, at our existing near-term actions. We looked at what could we accelerate, what could we bring forward, did a number of accelerations in the area of energy efficiency, demand response. We looked at our energy purchase agreements, and we decided to extend the period of time over which we would assume that we would renew electricity purchase agreements on a cost-effective basis. And then after doing that, we looked and we said, okay, what's remaining? And we concluded that we needed to do two things. First, we identified that we thought there was approximately 700 gigawatt hours of new clean or renewable energy available from existing facilities in the province that we felt we could acquire prior to fiscal 2029. And second, we determined that we needed to go out and acquire 3,000 gigawatt hours of new clean or renewable energy from greenfield facilities in the province, able to achieve commercial operation as early as fiscal 2029. One of the things I want to just touch on in the opening here as part of this workshop is the section of the Utilities Commission Act called Section 44.19. And this was a section that the Commission highlighted in its original procedural order that set up this workshop. And it's a section of the Act that allows the Commission, in making a decision to accept a long-term resource plan or accept part of a long-term resource plan, to consider other issues that have been determined as part of that plan as conclusively determined for the purposes of what I like to refer to as downstream proceedings. And so in the context of the new energy acquisition workshop this morning, when we think about future energy supply contracts that BC Hydro will sign as a result of this new energy acquisition process, those contracts will need to be filed with the Commission under Section 71 of the Utilities Commission Act. Section 44.19 allows the Commission, in accepting this long-term resource plan or a part of it, if that indeed is what the Commission decides to do, to say that certain issues that may apply to those Section 71 filings have already been conclusively determined and do not need to be revisited as part of those filings. And so BC Hydro's position going into this workshop today is that there are two such issues that the Commission may consider conclusively determined, we hope, as part of this process. The first is the volume of energy needed, the 3,000 gigawatt hours from greenfield energy facilities and the 700 from existing. And the second is the timing, the 700 prior to fiscal 2029 and the 3,000 as early as fiscal 2029. Those are two issues that BC Hydro submits the Commission could conclusively determine based on the existing record in this proceeding. The slide up now just summarizes some of the issues that we hope to cover today. We've put this presentation together, and I should have mentioned this presentation is available as an exhibit. It was filed on Friday, so it should be available to those that don't already have it. And we've put the presentation together today, keeping in mind the scope that the Commission outlined in Exhibit A48, and the list of issues on the slide there give you a sense of how we're planning to cover that scope today between myself, Sanjaya, and Frank. Lastly, before I hand it over to Sanjaya, I just want to highlight a few themes that I hope you'll hear from us today and that I think help to understand some of the points that we'll try to be making. The first, as I talked about a bit already, is readiness. When we talk about, well, why 3,700 gigawatt hours, why 3,000 from greenfield facilities, why 700 from existing, how did we arrive at that volume? In our view, it's really about readiness. It's about looking at the range of potential load scenarios that are out there that Anthea, Maureen, and Steve talked about last week, and coming up with a volume and a timing that we believe best positions BC Hydro to be able to meet those range of potential futures. Second theme that we hope you'll keep in mind is flexibility. We've talked a bit about our concept of a living long-term resource plan, the need to be more nimble and to update those plans more frequently. expect that one of the issues that folks may be interested in this morning is the potential for future calls for power after this initial call. And I think both of those things, both the Living Long-Term Resource Plan and how it will inform future calls for power that we expect we will advance as electricity needs continue to dictate, those two things really speak to the flexibility that we intend to focus on going forward. Third theme is competitive process and cost-effective pricing. Frank will talk a bit about today some of the things that we're thinking about putting in place for this call in terms of the parameters that we would be hoping proponents to meet. What I will say on those is that we still are very much in the early stages. Many of you likely have been involved in some of the consultation processes that have been underway to date with regards to the call for power. Those consultation processes continue. So we will share what we know today. We will share what we're thinking today. But I do want to emphasize that very much still under development in a number of areas, still listening to the input that we've received. But as I say, a key theme is within the parameters that we set for the call for power, we are focused on a competitive process that gets us a cost-effective price. And last, as I just talked a bit about already, really want to emphasize that we are open to input. We're currently working on the call design details. We're gathering input from First Nations, from stakeholders, from industry, on elements of the call and our overall approach. That input is vital to this call process, and the input that we hear from First Nations is going to help us understand how we can use this opportunity to implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in a way that is meaningful and tangible to the nations that we work with. As a company, BC Hydro has a commitment to advancing sustainable and lasting reconciliation and implementing the principles of UNDRIP in the context of our business. The call for power gives us an opportunity to advance UNDRIP principles with First Nations by engaging early and by working together to determine how meaningful participation and partnerships, including ownership of clean energy projects, can be built into the call design. We want to hear now from First Nations on how they would like to be engaged and on what is important to them in the design of this acquisition process. Our goal is to make sure that First Nations have the opportunity to benefit economically from the call for power and meaningfully participate in the clean energy industry. And with that, I'll turn it over to Sanjaya to continue on with his portion of the presentation.
Thank you, Chris. Good morning, everybody. My name is Sanjay D'Souza. I'm the Manager of Resource Planning at BC Hydro. And over the next few slides, I will be talking about how we arrived at the new energy acquisitions of 3,000 gigawatt hours from greenfield facilities, the 700 gigawatt hours of new energy from existing facilities. Now I will be also touching a little bit upon the mix of generation resources as well as the mitigation to rate impacts. And as I walk through this, I will be taking you on a bit of a journey through the IRP. I will be talking about how we developed the 2021 IRP, the signpost monitoring that we did, and how we came up with the signpost update. I recognize that some of you might be intimately aware of this, and my only intent here is to set the context to how we arrived at the new energy acquisitions of 700 gigawatt hours from existing facilities and the 3,000 gigawatt hours from greenfield facilities. So as I go through these slides, I will be talking about each one of those gray boxes that you see on that slide there. And this is a workshop on energy acquisitions, and my focus will be on energy and not capacity. So let's start our journey. So one of the first things that we do in developing an IRP is to look at forecasted future demand. So back in 2021, when we were doing the IRP, this is the range of possible future demand that we looked at. The dark blue line at the beginning shows our historical demand that has unfolded, and the lines next to it show the range that we considered. The line in the middle is our reference forecast, the one that we used in the development of the 2021 IRP, which is our 2020 December reference forecast. At the top which sets kind of the upper bound, that is a scenario where we envision the province meeting its GHG reduction targets and the electricity demand that arises out of that. And at the bottom is our low load scenario where demand stays fairly stagnant throughout the planning period. So we have the outlook of the demand. So the next thing we do is look at the supply that we already have. So right now in our system, most of our energy supply comes from our heritage hydro system, as well as from the contracts that we have with independent power producers. As you can see, that energy from the independent power producers include energy from a number of sources, including run-of-river hydro, wind, biomass, and so on. Now, as you can see here, when you look at the heritage hydro resources and the IPP generation, almost 90% of that is from hydro resources. And I really want to highlight that. And as we continue to monitor and study the variability of the energy from these resources in light of climate change, and this is something that you can expect to see regular updates from us in future resource plans. So we have the picture of demand, and we know what we have as our existing and committed supply. So the next thing we do is compare these two to see whether the supply that we have is sufficient to meet that future need. So here the gray, the orange kind of shaded area shows the range of demand that I described earlier. The orange line in the middle, that's our reference forecast, and the blue lines represent the supply that we have over the planning period. So whenever there's a gap between the demand and the supply, that's the signal we have, okay, if the supply that we have is not sufficient, so we need to take some action about it. Now, you might also wonder why the blue bars keep going down over time, and that's as a result of some of the agreements that we have with independent power producers expiring over time. Now, in the cases when we do have a gap between demand and supply, we do have a large number of options that are available to us to fill that gap. We maintain an inventory of these options in what we call our resource options database, or RODAT. And the options include things like demand-side management measures, or different levels of energy efficiency, options such as customer solar. We can renew electricity purchase agreements as they expire, and also get energy from new resources, such as wind, run-of-river, geothermal, and so on. Now, as I mentioned, we do have a large number of options. Some of these options, or some of these energy resources, are intermittent. Some emit GHGs. Some, like existing independent power producer facilities, are already on the ground. And some, like energy efficiency measures, require involvement from our customers. So how do we compare all of these resources with varying characteristics? We look at these through a number of planning objectives, which we've developed by looking at government policy objectives and as part of the feedback that we received during the IRP consultation process. And this slide lists the objectives that we have considered in the IRP. I do want to go into a little bit of detail on a couple of these. And one of them is keeping costs low for customers. And the reason I want to go in a little bit of detail into that, because it relates to one of the scope items that the Commission identified for the workshop, which is mitigations to ratepayer impacts. In building up our plan, and while looking at keeping costs low for our customers, we made sure we cover a spectrum of dimensions related to that particular planning objective. So we've looked at things like making sure we come up with the lowest cost, or the lowest, the set of resources that result in the lowest cost. And also looked at things like, so what is the rate impact of the strategy that we adopt. The other item I want to touch upon is our focus on clean or renewable energy resources and related to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. When we look at our resource options database, it has a large number of clean or renewable energy resources that are cost effective. During our IRP consultation process, the public and the feedback we received showed that reducing GHGs is a top priority. And as you think about resources that are not clean or renewable, things like gas-fired generation, there's lots of uncertainty associated with those, especially related to proposed federal and provincial regulations, such as the 100% clean electricity standard and the federal clean electricity regulation, as well as the carbon tax. Therefore, resources that are not clean or renewable are not part of our plan. So, as I mentioned, we do have a number of resource options to meet need, literally thousands, and with different characteristics. And when we look at the need over the different demand scenarios, it's pretty unlikely that one single resource can meet the demand over the whole planning period. So in identifying resources that can fill the need, we identify resource portfolios or combinations. And given that literally we have thousands of resources, we use a computer model to help us with that process. And as we create these resource portfolios, we don't do that randomly. We do that in a structured manner, which lets us understand how these resource portfolios behave in relation to our planning objectives. So I'll give you an example using energy efficiency. So during the IRP development process, and as we looked at energy efficiency, what we first did was we looked at a resource portfolio that had no energy efficiency. And we looked at how that particular portfolio measured in terms of our planning objectives listed there on the right. Next, we looked at, Mr. Austin, I'll just finish that slide and come back to your question. Next, we looked at a portfolio with the base level of energy efficiency. And again, went through the process of looking at how that portfolio measured up against our planning objectives. Then we went to an even higher level of energy efficiency. And as we went through that process, it became quite clear to us what were the trade-offs that are involved with varying levels of energy efficiency. As you do more energy efficiency, the cost of the portfolio keeps coming down. The environmental impact of that portfolio keeps coming down as well. And on the other hand, rate impacts associated with the portfolios do go up as we increase the level of energy efficiency. So let me take a quick pause there. Mr. Austin, I believe you had a question?
Thank you. I wasn't quite sure whether we asked questions as we went along or whether we waited until the end of a presentation, but I was advised that we can ask as we go along. So could you please go back to slide number 14? And slide number 14, second bullet, it says limit land and water impacts. In previous calls, there were restrictions on how much water storage you could, a project could have. And it was measured, I believe, sometimes in hours or amount of land that might have been flooded. And I was wondering whether, for the purposes of this in-process call, there would be similar restrictions as there have been in the past in relation to water storage.
I think maybe could we please hold that question till Mr. Lin finishes his presentation? Would that be okay?
Certainly.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And I'll just step in here because lots of things are new to me, but this is also new to me, and I'm used to running a process and making sure it goes on time. So I'm a little uncertain about how much I should intervene. So I'm going to leave it to BC Hydro for now to manage this process. So you'll manage the questions and determine to keep us on time for today. Is that acceptable?
Yes, I think that works for us. And I should have mentioned at the beginning, our plan was to stop at what we see as regular intervals. But as you just did, Mr. Austin, I think feel free if there's a question occurring to you in the moment to stop us and ask. But we do have about 3 junctures during the presentation where we're planning to stop for Q&A.
Oh, okay. Well, I think I will jump in then, and I'll ask.
Not quite sure what happened there. Yeah. Okay, thank you. So I've talked a little bit about, in the previous slide, about the trade-offs that were involved with in relation to energy efficiency. And considering this, especially the fact that with high levels of energy efficiency, we do get higher rate impacts. In the 2021 IRP, our near-term action related to energy efficiency was starting off with the base level of DSM and then moving on to higher levels as load growth unfolded. So now this process that I described in relation to energy efficiency, we do that for the other resources as well. And we did the same thing with relation to electricity purchase agreement renewals. And then we came up with a near-term action in the 2021 IRP that we would renew all the clean or renewable electricity purchase agreements set to expire before April 1, 2026. Now, when we went through that process and looked at the energy efficiency and the electricity purchase agreements, and then put the energy that we would get from those resources in relation to the load that we forecast, we saw that between those, they would fill the need till fiscal 31. And so we looked at this and then thought, okay, that does leave us sufficient time to do yet another IRP to determine what is going to be our next step in filling that gap after fiscal 31. Having said that, we did identify in the 2021 IRP, based on the analysis that we did for the 2021 IRP, what we would do, what we could do. And after doing more demand-side management measures, energy efficiency, we could continue to renew EPA electricity purchase agreements as they expire. And after that, we would be looking at new clean or renewable energy resource acquisitions. And I do want to highlight this slide, as I'll keep coming back to this as I talk more about our journey after the signpost update. So that, again, what I covered was our journey through how we developed the 2021 IRP. So why don't we take a break here and see if there are questions.
Good. You go ahead
Does that work?
Could we leave that particular question?
You leave that one till the end. Okay.
Finishes his
Yep.
presentation.
So, are there any other questions?
Good morning, David Ince, Commercial Energy Consumers. By the way, the name's spelled INCE for the transcript. So I've got a question about slide 14, Mr. De Zoysa. And one of your stated objectives, reduce greenhouse gas emissions.
Yes, Mr. Ince.
That's it. And can you confirm that BC Hydro uses a model called System Optimizer that looks at all the possible combinations and permutations of future resources and tries to come up with a least cost mix? Is that confirmed?
That's correct.
And in that model, is there a greenhouse gas tax effectively so that high emitting greenhouse gas projects will be penalized in the model?
Yes, in the system optimizer model, we can have the model impose a carbon tax effectively on GHG emitting generation.
So is the future legislated or relatively certain greenhouse gas tax included in that model?
So when we did the 2021 IRP, we went with the carbon tax that was announced and legislated at that time, which was $50 per ton.
Does that grow over time?
No, at that time, given that was the legislated carbon tax, we used $50 throughout the planning period.
Is there a potential double count in terms of greenhouse gas adders? So is the only penalty for greenhouse gas emitting projects in System Optimizer the forecast greenhouse gas tax, or are there other greenhouse gas penalties built in?
There are no other taxes built into the model. Mr.
Thank you.
Still on this slide 14, is the goal when you're reducing greenhouse gas emissions to reduce it for BC Hydro or for the province?
So in developing the IRP, and specifically as we did the modeling, it did look at in creating the supply portfolios, we looked at what's the GHG impact of that supply portfolio. I do want to emphasize.
On the province or just BC Hydro's portfolio?
Just BC Hydro's resource portfolio on the integrated system.
Thank you. I believe Mr. Andrews has one on Teams.
Yes, my question concerns the section 44.1 sub 9 requests by BC Hydro. Mr. Sandy identified the two requests that BC Hydro has from, that the commission panel make findings regarding the 3,000 gigawatt hours per year, the 700 gigawatt hours per year, and then a second finding to do with the timing. My question is, are those the only 44.1 sub 9 requests that BC Hydro has of the panel in this proceeding, or will we possibly be seeing more as events unfold?
Those are the only two that we have, and maybe I'll just elaborate on reasons why. The Commission put out, I think it was Exhibit A53 on Friday with regards to further process, not to preempt BC Hydro's submission, but BC Hydro supports the process that's set out in Exhibit A53. As Mr. Lynn will speak to in his portion of the presentation, there are a number of other details that we're in the midst of working on that set out different parameters of the call. But for those details to be in a position to be the subject of a Section 44.19 determination would, in our view, require a significant extension to the length of this proceeding, given that we are still very much in the middle of consultation. And so that is why our view is volume and timing are two issues where that opportunity exists. But in terms of details, in addition to that, our view is that those are best left for when the energy supply contracts are filed under Section 71.
Thank you for the response.
Are there any other questions within the hearing room? Mr. Stout?
Yeah, the cities would just like a clarification on that $50 per ton figure. It was our understanding that there's an escalation of $15 a year up to $170 per ton. I wonder if you could just reconcile those figures for us, please. Thank you.
Yes. So the $50 per ton was at the time when we were doing the 2021 IRP. That was the legislated carbon tax at that time. So we used that in preparing the 2021 IRP.
I have a question.
Yeah, there's.
Or there's just someone else.
I think there's one online.
You're muted.
Muted again.
You're muted again.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Shell Lim from the BC Community Solar Coalition. I have a question about the objectives in this update. There's a qualifier for the call for new energy being greenfield projects. Can BC Hydro define greenfield and maybe contrast it to other new energy projects?
I think Frank will get into that, Shell, when he gets to his portion of the presentation in terms of what we consider to be greenfield or not. So that might be best held for a bit if we can.
Sure, thanks.
Are there any other questions within the hearing room other than from the panel? Over to you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, I'll start, yeah. This is just sort of a methodological question, but I was interested in how you presented it, and I think maybe I just didn't understand, because I think you said you're going to estimate the amount of efficiency that's sort of cost-effective, and then you were going to estimate the amount of electricity purchase agreement contract renewals, and then you would put out a call, but the call is kind of going to determine your long-run marginal cost, which in turn should reflect back on how you decide how much energy efficiency or how, and also even the negotiation of the EPA renewals. So I got this sense that you do it sequentially, and which has a challenge. I know it's really hard not to do it sequentially, so maybe, but then one of the questions there was about the system optimizer, so maybe I'm hoping that then you bounce back and forth a few times as you do that, or maybe you can explain this problem of sequentially versus simultaneously when it comes to determining long-run marginal costs and determining how much resources from each one of your potential areas. Thanks.
Yeah, our focus on energy efficiency first is in alignment with the Utilities Commission Act, which asks us to look at energy efficiency first, all demand-side management measures. So we do that, and then we look at what other resources are required to meet need after that. Now, at the end of the process, the long-run marginal cost is an output of this whole process to say, look, here's the greenfield energy that's required, and what would be the cost of that. And that gets, so that output of the IRP gets used during the DSM evaluations as our energy efficiency folks decide what programs to pursue.
Got it. Thank you. Commissioner Brewer.
So I noticed that, and I'm thinking, I know that this is a shorter term acquisition, but I noticed that there's a heavy reliance on hydro in the overall supply. And I'm wondering if I know it's recent, but the trends toward drought and, the glacial melt and that sort of thing, if that's going to impact on your longer term acquisitions and even your shorter term ones in terms of looking at what you're acquiring.
Maybe I'll start, and Sanjay, Frank, jump in if you've got anything. I think I would make 2 points on that, Commissioner Brewer. I think the first is when we look at our resource options database, we do expect that wind and solar will likely be the focus of this upcoming new energy acquisition. That's not going to be a limitation. We certainly will have other resources potentially in the mix as well, but when we look at the resource options database and what it tells us in terms of what we expect may be cost effective, I think wind and solar are there, and so that'll bring some increased diversity to the supply mix as a result, we expect. I think the second point I would make on the reference to the drought is that one of the issues that we've highlighted in this proceeding that we do think needs further examination as we roll forward into this, what we hope will be this living long-term resource planning cycle, is planning criteria. And planning criteria in terms of resource adequacy standards, planning criteria in terms of looking at how we do our energy planning and the amount of energy we acquire and how we look at water levels and so forth. I think that's an area that for a number of reasons is evolving and is a focus of a number of jurisdictions, and I think it should be here as well.
Yeah, and if I could add to that, we have considered the impacts of climate change in developing the IRP, and the studies that we've done both on the impact of inflows and the impact of climate change on load, so warmer winters, probably hotter summers, those are detailed in Appendix 1 of the IRP.
Great. I think we're done with this section of questions, so you can go on with your next phase of your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, as we were doing the 2021 IRP, one of the things that we mentioned in that IRP filing was that over time, we would continue, that we would continue to monitor signposts related to both demand and supply and reflect those in our long load resource balances to see whether the actions that we had outlined in the 21 IRP were still holding. So we carried out such a process earlier in this year. And what we found out was that the actions that we set out in the 2021 IRP need to be augmented. So that's the next part of the journey that I'm going to take you through. So starting off with demand again. So this presents the updated load scenarios that were developed earlier this year. Similar to what the slide that I showed to you before, the blue line, the dark blue line at the beginning is the historical load, and the dotted line shows the updated range of demand scenarios that we are looking at in the signpost update. The light blue line at the middle is our original, is the December 2020 load forecast, reference load forecast that we used in the 2021 IRP filing. And as you can see, the dotted line in the middle is higher than that reference load forecast that was used in the development of the 2021 IRP. So following the similar process as we used in developing the IRP, we looked at supply as well. And this particular slide shows the updated reference load forecast, which is the line at the top, compared against existing and committed resources, as well as the planned elements that we identified in the 2021 IRP. So specifically the energy efficiency and the EPA renewals that I described. And as you can see, there's a gap starting in fiscal 2028, a very small gap in fiscal 28, that continues to grow. So this means we no longer have the luxury of waiting till another IRP, and that we have to expand our actions and possibly add new actions as well. Now, we said if need beyond what could be met by energy efficiency and EPA renewals up to 2026, that we would be looking at doing more energy efficiency, continuing with EPA renewals, and acquire new energy was what we identified, and that is exactly what we have done. We have advanced and expanded the cost-effective energy efficiency we target to get more savings sooner. So on the right-hand side, you see the expanded and advanced set of actions compared against what we mentioned in the 2021 IRP. We did the same thing with electricity purchase agreements. As we mentioned, as we outlined earlier, we are no longer stopping with renewals expiring April 1, 2026. For electricity purchase agreements, we will be looking at renewing all cost-effective electricity purchase agreements as they expire. Now, even with these expanded and advanced actions, we still see that there's a gap under the reference load forecast in fiscal 2029. So which means we need to even look at more actions beyond doing more energy efficiency and electricity purchase agreement renewals. And as we did that, so in the 2021 IRP, we said if there was added need, we would look at more DSM, continuing with electricity purchase agreements, and then looking at acquiring new energy. As we went to this third step of acquiring new energy, we first looked at if there was existing generation facilities within the province that either were producing energy or had the capability to produce energy that was not being currently delivered to BC Hydro and which we could acquire. Thinking about our planning objectives, energy from existing facilities are likely to be cost effective and also would have a lower environmental footprint. So that's why we looked at new energy from existing facilities first. We identified a limited volume of 700 gigawatt hours. And when we think about adding that to meeting our need, in this particular slide, that 700 has been added as supply, and we see that there's still a need in fiscal 2029. Now, which gets us to new energy from greenfield facilities. So we looked at energy efficiency, EP renewals, and new energy from existing facilities. And now we've got to think about what's the appropriate volume that we would want to acquire from greenfield energy acquisitions. And the key consideration here is achieving a balance between having a long-lasting surplus if we acquired more, against having, and thus having a negative impact on ratepayers, versus not having enough energy should risks to the upside unfold. So when you think about the uncertainties associated with both demand and supply, there's uncertainty related to demand. The energy need in fiscal 2029 under the reference load forecast is 350 gigawatt hours. But if the accelerated electrification scenario unfolded, that need could be high as 2,700 gigawatt hours. There's uncertainty related to supply. We have around 1,600 gigawatt hours of planned energy efficiency in the accelerated electrification scenario in fiscal 29, and there is a possibility that some of that energy efficiency may not materialize. We have around 1,200 gigawatt hours of electricity purchase agreements in our stack by fiscal, or renewal of electricity purchase agreements in our stack by fiscal 2029. Our strategy of re-signing those electricity purchase agreements might not be successful for all agreements. I've talked about the 700 gigawatt hours of energy that could be available from existing facilities. We may not be successful in getting all of that energy. The volume of greenfield energy that we've selected, we've arrived at a volume of 3,000 gigawatt hours, and we believe that it provides a buffer for these uncertainties and that it strikes an appropriate balance between having sufficient energy to meet higher than expected needs while minimizing any surpluses that might occur. So the next slide shows the surpluses and demand and the deficits, if any, when we include 3,000 gigawatt hours of greenfield energy in our supply. We would be in an energy surplus position of greater than 1,000 gigawatt hours per year for 2 years under the reference load forecast. And that surplus would be less than 1,000 gigawatt hours, so something that really is nice in the grand scheme of things in the years thereafter. We would be positioned to meet the accelerated electrification scenario. And should even higher need unfold, and there be the case for subsequent need for clean energy resources, those would be informed through BC Hydro's long-term resource planning cycle, starting off with the next long-term resource plan anticipated to be filed around 2025. So this particular slide really outlines what I just mentioned. And what I'd like to close with is a slide that shows our new near-term action related to acquiring approximately 700 gigawatt hours of new clean or renewable energy from existing facilities prior to fiscal 29 and the 3,000 gigawatt hours of new clean or renewable energy from greenfield facilities. Thank you.
This is our second stop.
David Austin, this may be a question for Mr. Lynn, but in relation to existing facilities, can storage be added to an existing facility, and would it still constitute an existing facility? Well, you don't have to. I can wait till later.
Okay,
I just wasn't quite sure when to ask the question.
Why don't I address the question in my presentation?
Thank you.
Mr. Andrews, online.
Thank you. On page 22, the comparison between the original IRP and the signposts update. In the update regarding conservation, there's no mention of capacity-focused DSM, whereas there is in the original IRP. Is that just an artifact of the focus here being on the acquisition of energy, or is there a change between the original and the signpost update regarding capacity-focused DSM?
There's no change. As Sanjaya mentioned at the beginning, for the presentation this morning, we focused on energy, and so what you're seeing on the slide there, Mr. Andrews, is just the energy components of that particular element. The capacity elements are still there. We just didn't highlight them in the presentation given the focus on energy this morning.
Thank you. On page 23, there's reference to renewal of EPAs that expire after fiscal 2026. My question is, are the supply amounts that come from those renewals included in the low resource balances that are shown on page 24 and later?
Yeah, they are, Mr. Andrews.
Thank you. Those are my questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Andrews. I understand there's another question from the online group. I don't know who that is, but if you can speak up.
Yeah, it's Travis Lesney, a power advisory with Clean Energy BC. On slide 24, and then I believe it's 28 is where you show the comparison of the reference and the accelerated. One of the clarifications is in determining the 3,000 gigawatt hour procurement. Actually, if we can go, I think it's slide 28 where it shows the post at greenfield energy acquisition. To that one, there we go, perfect, thank you. So we're looking at, with the 3,000 compared to the reference load, you end up in a surplus amount. However, against the accelerated electrification, you end up with a fast growing wedge Hydro has there been, as part of this plan, any longer procurement roadmap that may have smaller quantity steps, but more consistent steps that can be sped up or slowed down depending on where the demand outlook starts to lay, considering we're in this procedure that's almost 3 years. The next one might not start until 2025. We could be in a situation where you're having to pivot quite quickly without any kind of visibility on how you're making those changes. That's my first question. I have a second one now.
Sure. Thanks very much. Maybe I'll start, and Sanjay and Frank can jump in if they have other comments. I think a couple key points. The first one I would make is that we're not trying with this energy acquisition target of 3,000 gigawatt hours from greenfield and the 700 from existing to plan to ahead of the pin. We're not trying to plan to the reference. And so to your question about scalability and how do we kind of manage between these worlds, the 3,000 gigawatt hours, the 700 gigawatt hours is our view of how you best look at those uncertainties and come up with an initial acquisition that we believe best balances where we could be. I was reflecting over the weekend kind of on the way I look at it is the tale of the two 8,000 gigawatt hours. And so on the one hand, Mr. Lesney, I think Mr. Fitch on behalf of Clean Energy BC was talking about the issue you raise in terms of the potentially significant deficits that start to appear if we are on the accelerated electrification scenario track and that 8,000 gigawatt hours in fiscal 2031. On the other hand, Mr. Weaver with Commercial Energy Consumers, I think last week, spent some time with Ms. Jubb talking about the fact that there's about 8,000 gigawatt hours of oil and gas load in the reference load forecast. And Ms. Jubb spoke to why we believe there's reasonable certainty that that load will show up, but Mr. Weaver flagged that obviously there's a significant need driven by that 8,000 gigawatt hours, and that need potentially goes away to the extent that that load doesn't show up. So I think the way we look at it here is we've got these downsides, we've got these upsides, and they're both quite large. And we believe 3,000 is the best way to balance those two things, with the caveat that we will advance future calls as future need dictates, and we will make sure those calls are informed by this living long-term resource plan cycle.
Thank you very much. So shifting gears a little bit, on the 700 gigawatt hours of, I'll call it expanded capacity or energy acquisition, just for clarity, this is all expected to come from IPP facilities, not BC Hydro, is that correct?
That's correct.
And the analysis in terms of the capability of the 700 gigawatt hours has been done by BC Hydro without any engagement with IPP asset owners?
So I'd make 2 points there. I think the first is that there is an information request, I can pull it up if needed, that talks about how that 700 gigawatt hour number was developed. It was an initial preliminary estimate developed internally by BC Hydro as part of working on the signpost update. So I think one of the things I want to acknowledge that's a bit of a theme as we talk about certain things in the signpost update is that we recognized, I think, a need and an opportunity when we did the update to the integrated resource plan to use the fact that the proceeding was underway, that it was an active proceeding, to say, look, we think we need to make an update here, but we didn't want to take forever to do that, right? And so the work that we did to come up with that 700 gigawatt hour estimate was the work that we felt we were reasonably able to do in the relatively short time period of about 3 months that we had to update the plan. Now that we have that number out there, we are undertaking a process to engage with industry to talk about the acquisitions we're looking to make, and we'll take feedback and input in terms of the acquisitions that we move forward with.
Okay, that makes sense. And the 700 gigawatt hours is primarily existing capabilities, or would it be viewed as capital investments to unlock? And talk about it in the majority, not down to each gigawatt hour.
It's the former. So it's really looking at existing facilities and what they may already have available. The IR reference I was mentioning earlier, Sanjay just brought it up for me here. It's BCUC IR 4.150.1. That IR response will give you a bit of a sense of the nature of how we came up with that initial 700 gigawatt hour estimate. I will acknowledge there is a confidential portion to that answer. That portion is confidential because it actually goes into specifics around some of the individual opportunities that BC Hydro is aware of. Obviously, we don't want to reveal that, as it could impact those individual proponents or our position. But I think both the public information there as well as the confidential before the commission gives a sense of how the estimate was developed and what we're expecting to see.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much.
I'm going to move to Mr. Ince within the hearing room, and then there's a question online after that.
David Ince again from Commercial Energy Consumers. I'd like to refer to slide 23, and it's the upper right-hand bullet point, signpost update, and a market-based pricing. And I'd like to tie that into, Mr. Zoysa, you mentioned cost-effective, and there's another term called market-based, so I'd like to firm up some of those terms. So it says that a renewal option will be based on a market proxy price with independent power producers. And can you give us any sense in terms of where you think that trajectory is going to be, what a market price is? And is that Mid-Columbia is the best proxy for a market price?
Sure. Yeah, I'll start, and Sanjay may have more to add. And I'm just trying to find a reference that gets into this as we go here as well. So when we use the term cost-effective pricing or market-based pricing, Mr. Ince, really what we're looking at there is what we're talking about, the electricity purchase agreement renewals, a price that starts with looking at the market, but then there are adjustments to look at things like longer-term commitments and the certainty that we may have to give proponents over time in order to make that longer-term commitment. So it's not a strictly, mid-C or market-based price. It's starting there, but then looking at different adjustments that can be made and adders in terms of recognizing the need for longer-term certainty for a commitment. So maybe I'll start with that, and if I can find the reference here that goes into more detail, I'll get that for you.
Mr. Sadby, I know there's adjustments, but basically the heart of the issue is the market price itself. And do we have any sense in terms of what that magnitude is, mid-C, long-term pricing?
Yeah, so I found the reference here in the meantime. It's BCUCIR 4.152.2. That information request response really goes into what BC Hydro means in terms of the terms market-based pricing and cost-effective pricing. I think in terms, Mr. Ince, of details beyond that, that's not a particular area that myself or Mr. Zoysa are closely involved in, so that's probably the extent of the detail we can provide this morning, but hopefully that IR reference is somewhat helpful.
Well, can I ask about the market in terms of where do you think market prices are going, and what's a key driver of market prices? Will natural gas-fired units set the marginal price for the foreseeable future? Mr. Zoysa.
Mr. Ince, so again, we have touched upon that in a number of information requests. So there was a couple of parts to your question. In terms of the market price forecast itself, so the forecast that we develop, it's based on a proprietary forecast from Hitachi, so it's not publicly available. But the process that we've gone through in developing the market price is described in Chapter 5 of the IRP. And as for what really sets the marginal price, yes, so based on the information that we have, natural gas would be setting the market price like for a majority of time in the foreseeable future. And that's kind of what the experts from Hitachi believed. And again, we provided all these details in a number of information requests, and we can get those to you if that's helpful.
Well, can I get a sense of what that is? So presumably you've got a long-term gas price forecast of X and a heat rate of Y. You multiply the two together, and that should be, a rough market price proxy. So let's say $5 gas times a 7 or 8 heat rates, and do the math. And so that's a relatively modest price compared to the cost of new resources. Would you confirm that the cost of the market will be sustainably lower than the cost of new greenfield resources?
So again, Mr. Ince, like I said, the market price itself is confidential, so I cannot really comment on what the magnitude is. But what I can say is, so the market prices are typically based off on the variable portion of a generator. So when you think of that, yes, it's possible that that could be, the variable portion could be lower than like the full cost of new resources.
And related to that, new renewable resources have a zero marginal cost. They've got no cost of fuel. So we're talking about the market price in general in terms of imports and exports. Could it be a trend that market prices are decreasing because of the increased penetration of renewables in the markets?
Yes, that is certainly a possibility. And what I'd also like to highlight is, as part of the market price forecast, we have looked at a range of scenarios kind of similar to the demand forecast that we outlined. So we do have a high, mid, and a low market price range. And the low market price range could unfold due to a number of reasons, including a large penetration of renewables, which means that when renewables are on the margin for more periods over the course of the year, the average market price could in fact be lower. And that we believe would be adequately represented through the low market price scenario.
Thank you. And the risk of negative prices at some periods during the freshet.
Yes. So again, that's something we've discussed in responses to information requests, and we have explicitly taken that into account in the development of the market price forecast.
Mrs. Zoyce, I got one more question regarding.
If I could just cut in, because I'm troubled by this a little bit. I'd kind of appreciate it if one talked about short-run marginal cost versus long-run cost, because when you're acquiring resources, you have to think about their capital costs. And I'm not. You seem to be answering questions just based on that market clearing price in the short run, whether it's solar or gas. So I'm just finding that confusing when we are talking about new resource acquisitions and we're only talking short run. Maybe you can help me with that. Sorry to cut in on your question.
Yeah, so
I guess my question is, wouldn't your response be, hold on, we're not just going to look at the short run cost in the market when we're requiring new resources, or am I totally confused here?
I think Mr. Ince's line of questioning was more in terms of the electricity purchase agreement renewal price. Is that
but also imports and exports of BC Hydro itself, and in fact, going back to, you mentioned risk of market purchases to BC Hydro.
Yeah, so a couple of things I do want to clarify that under the reference load forecast, we've got to meet self-sufficiency. So in order to meet the reference load forecast, we do not rely on market inputs. Now, once we do get a resource into our stack, there might be times when some of that energy might be surplus just because by virtue of when that energy comes, and during other periods of the year, there might be a need to import. So when we develop the IRP, we take that into account. And as we compare different resources, different energy profiles, that's where the market price becomes relevant.
Well, related to that, since the panel's interested, now my theory of market pricing when I was doing price forecasting for BC Hydro for over 10 years was that the market was a dumping ground for surplus energy, so that if you got generation being built, that the capital costs were paid off, that the energy could be offered into the market at just the marginal cost of generation. So in the case of renewables, that's zero. In the case of gas, it's a heat rate. So is that a potential upside, subject to the self-sufficiency regulation, that BC Hydro could potentially be buying significantly lower energy in the long term, again, absent the self-sufficiency reg?
Mr. Ince, I'm not sure if this gets to the point you're trying to make, but I'll try it to start anyway, and you can let me know. I mean, as Sanjaya mentioned, when we look at the reference load forecast and plan to meet the reference load forecast, we can't rely on the market. However, when we look at load scenarios and higher load scenarios, that is an option that's available to us. And so when we talk again about, how do we strike this right balance between the range of load scenarios that there are, certainly one of the things that we can consider when we look at that upside risk of that accelerated electrification load scenario is the availability of the market to act as a temporary bridge to when we can procure new domestic resources should we be trending in a higher load direction. Conversely, the market is also there, as you say, as a place, maybe a bit of a hedge, if I can put it that way. If we are in a surplus position, the market is there as a place to take that surplus in the event that we're more solidly on the reference load forecast before returning to that balanced position that Sanjay spoke about earlier.
Yeah, thank you. I promise just one more question. This is about imports from, let's say, the Mid-C or Alberta market. How much energy can BC Hydro reliably import from adjacent markets?
So, again, this is something that we've described in a response to a BCUC IR, and maybe it's most efficient if I just point you to that. It's BCUC IR 153.1, where we've described how BC Hydro transacts through PowerX to get the inputs that we need and what are the available energies.
In the interest of efficiency, I really appreciate that answer. And I think so whenever someone here asks a question and you know you've already answered it, it's great if you could just point us to the reference or even make an undertaking to get back to people with that bit of information. I mean, unless you think it's really good for the whole group to go over that again. Thanks very much.
Thanks. I'm not going to pick on Mr. Ince here because I understand we're all guilty of it. I've been informed by the transcription service that we need to hold the microphones a little bit closer to our mouths when we're speaking and to speak a little more slowly and clearly, both online and within the room. So I'm just going to move to the, I understand there's an online guest who has a question.
Yeah, Scott Jansen with Hereditary Chiefs and Kanaka Bar Indian Band. I just wanted to ask about the two slides, slide 20 and slide 10. In both slides, it states the demand scenarios. And when I hear demand, I think of capacity, and I know that this presentation was not supposed to be of capacity, so was that intended to be load scenarios?
The intent was, so when I mentioned demand, I meant electricity demand in general. And yes, as I said at the beginning of my presentation, the focus today is on energy.
All right. So just the key point there is that your demand charges on your tariff are related to capacity, not related to load or energy. So I just wanted to just make that clear for everybody in the room. The other thing is on slide 3, there's the 3 components that you're looking at here, and one of the middle component is to build capacity services. Now, energy to add into the grid is going to require capacity to add that energy to the grid. So inherent in an energy acquisition is also going to be a capacity acquisition or capacity build. The question is, will BC Hydro look at actually buying some of those capacity services? Case in point, utility scale batteries, in addition with the energy acquisitions.
Section.
We were just talking here, Mr. Jensen, that I think that's a topic that Frank is going to get into in his part of the presentation. So maybe we'll just take that at that point if that works for you.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jansen. We'll move to Irina Miss with BCOAPO.
Irina Miss, MIS. I have a follow-up question with respect to the 700 gigawatt energy that will come from existing IPPs. And you mentioned that it is available and does not need any capital investment to make it available. What is currently happening to this energy? if it is currently being produced and sold to or used by other parties inside BC, then won't BC Hydro's acquisition increase the demand these parties will place on the BC Hydro system?
Yeah, so Ms. Meese, I'd refer you to BCUCIR 4.150.1, and in that response, we state, and I'll just read a brief portion here just for the room's awareness, that there is incremental generation from existing facilities who are currently not selling this energy to BC Hydro based on a preliminary assessment of IPP capability that is not currently contracted under an electricity purchase agreement. So it's, I think, further details in that response, but that should speak to the issue you're raising.
Are there any other questions within the hearing room? Yep, just a couple here. RCIA.
Matthew Matuziak, RCIA. Thanks for taking the time to prep the workshop today. I had a question about slide number 22, specifically the column on the right-hand side. And just for additional context, I'll be referencing, a response to BCUCIR 4.129.2. So you've indicated in the slide achieving approximately 1,800 gigawatt hours per year of energy savings. In the response to the aforementioned IR, you've indicated volumes and timings of the updated IRP elements move towards elements of the contingency resource plan associated with the accelerated electrification load scenario. An element of that contingency resource plan indicates energy savings of approximately 2,080 gigawatt hours per year. I recognize the 1,700 figure in the left-hand column, but in the context of the contingency plan, that appears to be a reduction in reduced energy savings. I was wondering if you could clarify that discrepancy.
Yeah, and so the short answer there is that is related to the energy efficiency activities undertaken in fiscal 22. So when we were doing the load forecast, those were considered in the load forecast and reflected as a reduction in demand. And we provide the details of that in the response to BCUCIR 4.141.1.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Next is Untitled Tribal Council, Mr. Austin.
BC Hydro, I'm just seeking a couple of clarifications because I thought I understood this coming into this workshop session, but now I seem to have lost my train of thought on it. If we go to slide 23.
David, please hold the microphone closer up.
It says over on the right-hand side, offer a market price-based renewal option. And in the bullet below it, it says on a cost-effective basis. And as I understand what we've been advised, those are the same prices. There's just because we've got two different terms, that doesn't mean they're two separate prices. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's Robson. I think we're just trying to find it again here. I recognize, I think, that those terms have caused a bit of back and forth, but we did try to reconcile the use of those terms in the IR I was referencing earlier on market-based pricing and cost effectiveness. So I can try to find it again here, but I think we've got it on the record perhaps already.
If it's on the record, I'll find it. That's not a problem. The next thing, I just want to go back to what Chair Jackard was saying. It seems as if for a renewal of 25 years, and correct me if I'm wrong, we're using a short-term price based on a spot market in the United States. Is that correct?
Not necessarily. So I found the reference now. It's BCUCIR 4.152.2, and maybe I'll just read a brief portion that I think will help clarify. We say, in developing market-based pricing approach for EPA renewals, BC Hydro considered wholesale market prices with certain price adjustments to achieve longer-term agreements with counterparties to reflect longer-term market forces and the potential benefits of avoiding greenfield supply in latter years. So think that hopefully gets to your question that we're looking at that market price, but then there are adjustments to scale that price up based on longer term commitments.
And if you've already established this, please stop me, but what might those adjustments consist of?
Those details aren't ones that myself or Sanjaya have at our fingertips. I do think we provided some of those details in previous information request responses, so we can get those references for you, but I don't think either Sanjaya or I have them close at hand.
And the final observation, in the 2022/23 annual service plan report, BC Hydro provided an update to the forecast for mid-C, and it was in the range of about $90 per megawatt hour. And I was wondering whether that in any way impacts your estimation of the mid-C price that was derived from your consultants for the purposes of the 2023 signpost update.
So, Mr. Austin, I can talk a little bit about the forecast derivation very briefly. So our market price forecast, again recognizing it's confidential, does take into account the short-term prices in terms of what's predicted by market forwards, as well as the longer-term forecast by Hitachi.
Are there any other questions within the hearing room? Yeah, oh, sorry, staff has a question.
Thank you. Phil Stallard for BCUC staff. If you could just go to slide 27, please. And this is referring back to your discussion of an earlier question, Mr. Sanvi, around the where you sort of landed on that 3,000 gigawatt hour volume. And on the third bullet point, this is really just a methodological question as to whether BC Hydro, in determining the appropriate balance for the volumes of new energy acquisitions and considering those upside and downside risks, whether you used your structured decision-making methodology, whether there was any probabilistic assessment of those upside or downside risks, or if there was something else employed there.
Yeah, thanks very much. We didn't use a probabilistic assessment to come up with the 3,000 gigawatt hour number, and I would link this back to a comment I made earlier just in terms of trying not to plan to the head of a pin. Really how we came up with the number was an iterative process, started off with Sanjaya, myself, and others in the energy planning team, looking at the range of load scenarios, looking at the different outcomes, and saying, okay, what do we think a number is here that really best balances that? We took that forward to our executive team as part of the signpost update and moving it through to our board of directors, and had much the same dialogue that we've had here this morning in terms of how to arrive at appropriate numbers. So it really was an iterative process developed through many layers of review, did not rely on a probabilistic assessment. And again, I think that goes back to we're really trying not to be too fine here, but really be ready for a range.
Are there any other questions within the room? No, and I understand there's none online. Mr. Chair and BC Hydro, I wonder if, I note the time, if this is a good time for a break before we start?
Sure, let's take a 10-minute break. Is that, all right, well, a 10-minute break. Thanks. All right, thanks everyone. I see we're all getting seated, so BC Hydro, please go ahead, Mr. Lane.
So good morning. My name is Frank Lin. I'm the Director of Interconnections at BC Hydro, and I'm also leading this call for power for BC Hydro. So in my presentation today, I will be providing an overview of our call. I will be speaking to how we're planning to design the call to minimize ratepayer impacts. And I will also speak to a very important aspect of this call for power, and that is how we're incorporating UNDRIP into this call for power, ensuring strong and meaningful participations from First Nations. So in terms of how we're planning to approach this call, it is important that we design this call to result in cost-effective supplies for BC Hydro and our customers. And to do that, we're planning to acquire energy that with attributes that align with the needs of our system. In our contract and evaluation, we will favor those projects that offer generation profile that are of higher value to BC Hydro. We are targeting supplies to come online as early as fiscal 2029. We will provide an in-service window to provide sufficient time for bidders to bring their projects online. And we think this strikes the balance between the need to address the system needs and providing sufficient time to accommodate project development. We are targeting large and clean energy. We are targeting large, clean, and renewable projects consistent with the definition of the Clean Energy Act. We are targeting larger projects to take full advantage of economies of scale. Again, as I said earlier, we will be requiring strong and meaningful participation from First Nations, which I will speak to in a minute. So this slide shows our current schedule. Since the announcement by the Premier on June 15th, we have been engaging extensively with First Nations, IPPs, and other stakeholders on key aspects of our call. We're expecting to continue our engagements through the balance of this year. And based on the feedback, we will provide draft EPA and RFP document early next year for final round of comments. And we're currently scheduled to launch a call in spring of next year. We're currently planning a 7-month procurement schedule, 4 months for bid preparation and 3 months for bid evaluation. The finalization of the schedule is subject to engagements. So this slide shows the engagements we have done to date. As you can see, the engagements have been quite extensive. I won't go line by line, and we have 2 more rounds of engagements to go. The engagement phase of this call is critically important to us because we think that's required for us to design a competitive and a successful call. So BC Hydro is committed to reconciliation and the principles of UNDRIP. Through this call for power, we're requiring strong and meaningful participation on projects. And our goal is to settle on a First Nation participation model that advances economic reconciliation of First Nations through meaningful partnerships between First Nations and IPPs. Whatever model we landed on also needs to be able to be implemented in a procurement process in a clear, consistent, and transparent fashion. As you can imagine, perspectives and preferences from nations vary. Some nations prefer optimal or maximum level of discretion and flexibility around how they define the extent and the manner in which they participate in this call, while others prefer more of a prescriptive ownership type model. So based on the feedback we received in the summer, we developed 3 potential options for further engagements, and these options were presented in a workshop or series of workshops in September. So the first model allows the developer and First Nations to develop their own participation agreement. The nature of the participation agreement is entirely between nations and IPPs. In the call process, we will require a letter of endorsement as evidence of participation. The second model requires the development of evaluation criteria and assessment of economic benefits accrued to the nations as part of the IPP project. Types of benefits evaluated could include royalty payments, job and training opportunities, or procurement opportunities. This approach will require an evaluation approach to quantify and value the extent of economic benefits and determine how these benefits are factored in the overall evaluation and selection process. The third model involves minimum level of First Nation ownership of the entity owning the power project. Ownership can be held by one or multiple First Nations and would be proven by way of organizational chart or ownership agreements in the context of a call requirements. Now, it is quite possible the option we ended up with is a variation to one of the options presented today or a combination of different options. What is important at this point in time is that we receive feedback and inputs on the relative merits of these options. Practical considerations on how we implement these options in the context of a rigorous procurement which value fairness, clarity, and transparency are also important inputs that we're seeking at this point in time. So in addition to First Nation participation models, we have also developed preliminary positions on a number of key parameters on the RFP as well as on the EPA for engagements. These are not exhaustive list of parameters, nor are they final, which will be determined based on the engagements and feedback we receive in the coming months. On the project size, we're looking to set a minimum project size between 30 to 50 megawatt. As I said earlier, we're targeting a larger project to take advantage of economies of scale, and also to help us manage the number of proposals and requests that we have to interconnect. We're also proposing to set a maximum project size of 200 megawatt so that we don't have a scenario where one or two proposals take up the entire call volume, which will introduce attritional risk for the awarded portfolio. On target commercial operation date, we're proposing a 3-year window for project to come online. We think it strikes a balance between anticipated system need and addressing the lead time required for project developments. With a 3-year window, projects have about 4 to 7 years to finalize permitting, procurement, and construction once EPAs are awarded. On project location, projects must be located in BC, interconnecting to BC Hydro's integrated system. For those projects that are located in FortisBC's service territory, they must arrange to have their power wheel and deliver to a point of interconnection on BC Hydro system. We are seeking new/green generation in this call. By that I mean generation from new generators. Expansion to existing projects are eligible, but they must be metered separately from existing projects. Low displacement arrangements are not permitted for this call. Projects must be clean and renewable as defined by the Clean Energy Act and use proven generation technologies. Proven generation technologies are those that are readily available in commercial markets and can meet a standard reliability generally required by good utility practice. So we have also developed preliminary positions on key contractual terms for engagement. The development of the contract will ensure reasonable allocation of risks between IPPs and BC Hydro, and will generally follow the principle of allocating risk to the party that's best able to manage. On contractual price, on the escalation front, we're proposing full CPI escalation prior to COD and 25% CPI post-COD. COD stands for commercial operation date. The contract pricing structure will also include a time of delivery factor table to adjust energy price based on the time the energy is delivered. The time of delivery factor table will be designed to reflect the relative value of energy to BC at different times of the year or different times of the day. In general, the value of energy is aligned with the times during which our customer needs the energy the most. With this table, a project with more favorable generation profile will receive higher revenue, all things being equal, which in theory should allow them to lower their bid price, making them more competitive in the selection process. Contractual terms, we are proposing a 25-year term for our contract. In our engagement, we heard that contractual term longer than 20 years are easier to finance and bring down financing cost, which ultimately, again, should benefit our customers by way of cost-effective supplies. On in-service date, we're proposing penalty for missing in-service date deadlines, but within the 3-year COD window, we are considering providing incentives to the extent the project can be delivered generation early. The actual payments, the structure are currently under development. We would have more to share in November. Additional contractual terms are including the following: exclusivity, all project output must be sold and contracted to BC Hydro. On environmental attributes will be transferred to BC Hydro under the contract. The value of environmental attributes included in the energy price, so there will be no additional payment for environmental attributes. On delivery shortfall, we're not proposing liquidated damage for delivery shortfall unless a capacity product is contracted as part of this process. Provisions such as curtailment rates and deemed energy events for prolonged system constraints will be included in the contract. Termination events and payments typical to industry standards and to BC Hydro's recent EPAs will also be included. I mentioned earlier in the presentation that we are designing this call to minimize ratepayer impacts, and one of the ways to do so is to properly identify the cost and benefits a project introduced to our system, and that the costs and benefits are properly assessed and evaluated and considered in the selection process. So the 3 adjusters are examples of adjuster we will be including in our evaluation approach. The first adjuster is a capacity adjuster. Even though this is a call for energy, capacity does have value to BC Hydro. So a proponent with technology that's capable of offering capacity and chooses to offer such capacity to BC Hydro under the contract, we will adjust the bid price downward by the capacity credit to make the bid more competitive in the selection process. The second adjuster is the integration adjuster. So this is to recognize that there is a cost to BC Hydro to integrate intermittent resources, such as wind and solar. These 2 types of project will receive a adjuster of $2 per megawatt hour, which, all things being equal, make these 2 technologies less competitive. The third adjuster is the interconnection adjuster. We will adjust the bid price upward by the cost of transmission impact the project has on our system. These impacts include costs of project-specific network upgrades, as well as estimated losses and transmission costs these projects have on our system. The adjuster will make a project that has modest transmission impact more competitive compared to a project that requires extensive transmission reinforcements. I'll quickly touch on how we'll manage interconnection activity to support this call. Prior to contract award, we will follow the competitive energy acquisition process part of the open access transmission tariff. This aspect of the tariff governs how we establish base case, assign queue positions, and undertake the necessary studies to support the call. The results of the studies will provide meaningful information to the bidders to help them with their bid preparation, as well as to BC Hydro in our selection process. After contracts are awarded, those that receive contract will then follow the standard generator interconnection procedure as defined by open access transmission tariff. I'd like to point out that in November, we plan to issue additional system information related to our transmission system, helping the bidders identifying areas of potential transmission constraints. We think this will provide additional visibility to bidders and help them better assess the risk and opportunities associated with their bid from a transmission standpoint. So what is coming up next? So we are still in the midst of our engagement. To date, we have released select terms of our EPA and RFP for engagements. In November, we'll release our draft EPA and RFP for further engagement. And based on the feedback received in November, we'll prepare a fully drafted specimen EPA and the RFP document in January for final round of comments. And based on the results of that engagement, we will finalize our terms for the procurement in time for the launch of the call, currently scheduled for spring of next year. Before I take any questions, I jotted down 4 questions. Maybe I can respond to them before I take any additional questions. So I think the first couple are from Mr. Austin. I think the first question is related to whether or not BC Hydro is planning to place limitation on storage as we have done so in the past. So I don't recall BC Hydro ever place limitations on storage. In fact, I think it's the opposite. We value storage because it has value to BC Hydro. Mr. Austin, I don't know if I'm correct, but you may be referring to limitation on the amount of freshet energy that can be considered firmed for the purpose of EPA.
There were restrictions on the amount of storage that could be used in relation to hydro generation. I'd have to go look it up, but the question I have now is, are you planning similar restrictions in relation to greenfield energy on the hydroelectric side?
Okay, so the best way that I can respond to your question is that we are still planning to issue price signal to encourage those projects with favorable generation profile, right? So all things being equal, we still prefer generation to come during winter as opposed to freshet. But we're not planning to place additional or any limits on the amount of freshet energy for this procurement. I don't know if you're referring to BC Hydro including consideration for the amount of firming or integration that we have to include to integrate renewable resources. If that's the question, the answer is yes. If you go back to this slide, slide 40, we are planning to add integration adjusters to account for the fact that there is costs of integrating these renewable resources. The adjusters have come down since 2010.
Maybe a simpler way of putting it is if a First Nation came along with a project and it was going to have a substantial reservoir associated with it, and it would have to create the reservoir or raise a lake level, and if it could get it permitted, then is BC Hydro going to in any way restrict the amount of storage that the project would have? And by restricted, I mean in relation to criteria in relation to storage, meaning that you can only have storage, for example, for 24 hours or a certain volume of water in your reservoir.
Well, as I said earlier, if a project comes with storage, we definitely would like to see it. We would encourage it. And we will encourage it by way of capacity credit, as well as the 2x12 table that I make reference to in my presentation. We're not contemplating any limitation on storage at this point in time.
That's the first question, and I think there's another question that I had outstanding.
Yeah, I think you had questions about what happens or the eligibility of a project that introduced storage to an existing project and whether or not such configuration is eligible for the purpose of this call. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. So I think I'm reluctant to comment on eligibility of project configurations on the fly because we're still in the midst of engagements. I guess maybe I'll just point out the fact that this is a call for energy. So our thinking will likely be influenced by whether or not the addition of storage results in additional energy or is it really just for firming and shaping support for the existing assets. So there's So there's a lot of questions that we need to think about, but if such project configuration does in fact exist, I think it's probably better that we receive that, that description of project configuration, and then we can make proper decisions around it.
I'm somewhat confused now because I look at slide 4, capacity credit. And now what I'm hearing is that, at least in terms of existing projects, you're not sure whether you'd be providing a capacity credit for an existing project if the project was reconfigured in some way, say for example, a wind project where the contract was up for renewable and they installed some batteries.
Yeah, so as I said earlier, I think the eligibility need to be interpreted by a combination of different things, right? There's a capacity component, which BCS definitely is in favor of. In fact, we're providing incentive and signals to encourage those type of projects. But at the same time, we are procuring generation that's new. And so, as I said in my remark to you, Mr. Austin, I'm unable to answer that question because I don't know whether or not that configuration results in new energy for the purpose of this procurement. And so I just need to know the details around it before I can answer that question.
And to speed things up and for convenience, I just have one other question on slide 40, and that's in relation to the capacity credit. And it says BC Hydro may consider providing a capacity credit in the RFP. What does BC Hydro value its storage at for the purposes of assessing capacity?
So we are planning to issue additional information in November on the value of capacity and how we plan to adjust for capacity value in the procurement. But I believe the way that we're thinking about capacity is to look at what our marginal supply for capacity is, and currently I think that's battery storage.
And so you're not, the fact that you've got existing reservoir storage that's surplus to current domestic requirements is not going to play into that evaluation?
As Frank said, Mr. Austin, so the capacity credit, given that these are new acquisitions, would reflect also like what's the cost of incremental new capacity that this capacity would bring an offset possibly.
So the answer is no. You are not going to be evaluating BC Hydro's existing reservoir storage that's surplus to domestic requirements?
I'm not quite sure I followed the question, Mr. Austin. So when we think about acquiring new energy, we recognize some of that new energy would bring some capacity contribution, which in turn could offset the need for buying capacity from another source. So we would give a credit to reflect that, and that credit would be based on the capacity that is being offset, which in our case is based on utility scale batteries.
Since it's just a workshop, I'm not going to engage in any cross-examination, but it would be helpful if you set your minds to the use and value of BC Hydro's reservoir storage as it relates to this particular call, because it seems as if it's not being considered at all.
I think, Mr. Austin, we can take that away. What my summary at this stage would be, I think we're maybe have a different perspective on what the marginal resource is. So BC Hydro's position is the marginal resource, the avoided resource is utility scale batteries. I think you may be suggesting that we should be looking at the existing reservoirs as a marginal comparison. I don't think that's the approach we're taking, but as Frank mentioned, I think further engagement to come in November, so we'll take it away for that.
Did you want to finish answering your other questions first?
Yeah, so I think there was a questions about definition of new and greenfield generation. I think I answered that question in my presentation, but I'm happy to, elaborate if I didn't. And the last question was I think questions around combination of solar and battery storage and whether or not that would be eligible for this call. I think our current thinking is that configuration will be eligible under this call.
Thank you. There's a number of questions from the online community. So Scott Jansen, would you like to go first, please?
Yep. So I just want to have a little bit of more information on slide 37. I see there that there is a 3-year window for COD. And specifically in the Get Now territory, what we're seeing now is a 2 to 5 year study period for interconnections. I'd just like to hear an answer of how BC Hydro can meet the 3-year COD when we have a study delay that could overlap that COD period.
Sure. So the COD window is the period for which projects can come online. But the amount of lead time that's available to bidders is not 3 years, right? So if you remember what I said, the contract award is currently scheduled for November of 2024. So if you use as a starting point and work it to the end of calendar 3031 or fall 3031, that worked out to be about 4 to 7 years of development lead time, which I think will include the lead time necessary for interconnections. It is true that the whole interconnection file is pressure because the amount of electrification opportunities that are out there right now, and really the folks that are working on low interconnections are the same people that are working on generator interconnections. So we, BC Hydro, is in the process of developing a number of different strategies to hopefully that we can reduce the amount of lead time that's required to interconnect these projects.
So will new load be prioritized in the interconnection queue?
As a general statement, no. I think we will.
Oh, sorry. I have to rephrase. Not new load, new energy acquisitions under this call.
I don't. So we are treating all the priorities in terms of interconnection with loads and generation equally, and so we will need to do our absolute best to interconnect both types of requests. And I wouldn't say, and I don't think it's correct to say that we will prioritize one over the other. There is generation timelines, study timelines as part of the open access transmission tariff, and we'll do our absolute best to meet those timelines.
Okay, and then one other thing that we have seen with certain proponents connecting to the grid, will BC Hydro create a pathway just to increase the throughput of studies where independent contractors or companies that can actually do the study on behalf of BC Hydro, the interconnection study, to streamline the process and make it quicker?
So I think the short answer is maybe. In theory, that's what we would like to pursue, and we are trying to pursue not just letting third party doing a study on our behalf, but also exploring opportunities for BC outsourcing studies as well, and hopefully create additional capacity to reduce study timelines. In practice, our system can be very complicated and nuanced, and the experience that we have would suggest that it's not as easy to have a third party to come in and start doing studies on our behalf. And so it's not as straightforward as we're suggesting, but I understand the premise, and that's something we are looking into as potential opportunities for this particular call, and also for interconnections in general.
Thank you. One other question to follow up on this, and on another slide, or a few questions. On slide 40, we have all the other attributes that are in here. specifically on capacity credit, I know we're talking about capacity in terms of general system capacity. Is there going to be some sort of credit for local or voltage support? Capacity that is locally based?
It likely will come in on a project-specific basis. So as part of the interconnection activities to support this call, we will be conducting feasibility studies to identify, as I said during my presentation, the network upgrades that's required to connect an IPP project. I think it is possible and probable, to the extent that we identify local benefits associated with a particular project, we will take that into consideration. But it's hard to make a generalization because it will be a very project-specific situation.
Agreed. I'm looking also at integration costs, interconnection costs. There could also be interconnection and integration credits on those sides where there are situations where there is a bottleneck in the system, and having this project in there is going to create an avoidable cost for BC Hydro, or deferrable costs that'll go into the future. I imagine that's going to be the same answer on that, right? That BC Hydro will be incorporating that in the whole project.
Yeah, my response is the same, Mr. Jensen.
Yeah. One, and then the final question on this, and I know you were talking about low displacement projects will not be included. It may be interesting to include projects that include new generation plus net new load. As we see in the load forecast, we have a lot of industries that are actually decreasing. And there are stranded assets in terms of wires across the province. We have areas where there's extra capacity, and there's areas where there's not enough wire capacity. In areas where you can actually add new load and add generation, it's just more of a suggestion to think that would be a useful model to look at, and maybe in a parallel process, because it is a different thing, because you're adding load and generation at the same time.
Yeah, I think the reason we're excluding low displacement is because very often a low displacement project involves very significant integration with the customers, and it's hard to acquire such generation in a sort of open competition. So I think arrangements like that are probably better off on a bilateral negotiation under other programs as opposed to as part of this acquisition program.
Are there other programs that look at that?
Yeah, I was just advised that there's actually a low displacement program currently underway and worked on by BC Hydro. So that's probably the better place for it.
Oh, okay. So sorry, to clarify on that, the idea is a greenfield new project coming up that has a component, let's say a wind farm that's attached to it. So you're having a substation that has, you share the cost of having that substation and that interconnection to the transmission grid with a customer load at the same site as where the wind farm is.
Okay, I think I understand the premise. My comments about having both load and generation together in the context of a procurement program still stand. But to the extent that such configuration exists and there's interest, I think we're open to listen to the feedback and consider them as part of the engagement process.
Thank you. That's all my questions.
Okay, thank you. Next, we're going to Mr. Andrews with BCSEA.
Yes, I'd like to turn to slide 34 and the timelines. My first question is to confirm that the timelines that are set here are to do with the call for the 3,000 gigawatt hours per year and not the 700 gigawatt hours per year. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So, and I recognize that this timeline here is intended to focus mainly on the engagement, but looking at the right-hand side there, I assume that BC Hydro will apply to file EPAs resulting from the call with the BCUC under Section 71. And my questions are, does Hydro anticipate filing those EPAs as a batch? And secondly, does the duration of any ensuing BCUC proceeding affect the, like in BC Hydro's estimation, affect the viability of the CODs?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Mr. Andrews. So the filing of the agreements under Section 71 would take place after the award of the contracts in November 2024. We would expect that we would file them as a batch together, and we have built that review timeline into the implementation and construction timeline that is shown there.
Thank you. Looking at slide 37, and under the heading eligible resource types, new, clean, or renewable, clean or renewable being a defined term under regulation. Does Hydro anticipate proposals that involve biomass or municipal solid waste being bid into the call? There's also a similar reference on page 40 to do with capacity credits.
Yeah, so any technology that meet the definition of clean and renewable pursuant to the Clean Energy Act, I think will be eligible.
Are you able to comment on whether you anticipate biomass or municipal solid waste?
So my understanding is biomass is considered clean and renewable, so they would be eligible for this call. I think MSW, I'm less sure of MSW, but we can maybe consider the question and then give you a response shortly. But I don't know whether MSW qualifies.
To clarify, I'm not asking whether MSW would qualify as clean or renewable. It's on the assumption that a project would qualify as clean or renewable. Have you had expressions of interest from MSW type projects?
Not that we're aware of.
Thank you. Last, I guess there was a question about the meaning of greenfield, and I can give a reference for the benefit of participants, which is Exhibit B44. Hydro said in response to BCSEA Viva 4.19.2 described what Hydro meant by greenfield, and that's at PDF page 247. Thank you. Those are my questions.
Thank you, Mr. Andrews. I'm not ignoring those in the room. I'm just going to clear the online questions first, as we're doing this on a first-come, first-served basis. So clean energy, Mr. Lusney. Sorry if I mispronounced your name. You're muted. You try that again? We're not receiving any audio, I understand. Okay, we'll move on to it looks like Mr. Liam, do you have a question, or your yellow hand is now gone? I assume that question has been answered. Mr. Liam?
Yes, no further questions. Thank you.
Okay, I'm just going to finish the hearing room, and then we'll come back to you, Mr. Lusney.
Okay, thank you.
David Ince for commercial energy consumers.
Hello, Mr. Lynn. The commercial energy consumers, my client, their number one concern in this entire proceeding is the potential for stranded costs and excess generation then being sold into the market at a big loss. And last week we heard about the LNG and oil and gas sector and growing to over 8,000 gigawatt hours a year. And that's a growth of over 5,000 gigawatt hours a year over current levels for that sector. And in addition, there was testimony by BC Hydro that this is a very uncertain sector, that these are large, lumpy loads that potentially may not occur. I mean, forecasting is easy except for forecasting the future, but these loads may not occur, and our concern is that are there out clauses or provisions within the EPAs or the process whereby that if these loads did not occur according to some signpost that was identified, that perhaps the project proponents who had signed EPAs were given a payment to, let's say, stay on ice, to recover their capital, to pay for their time, but then basically to put themselves on hold until that load showed up again. So is there an out clause built into the EPAs or the process?
So, Mr. Ince, I'll start from just kind of more of a planning context, and then Frank may have more to add with regards to particular contractual approaches. So I do want to, I think, set the correct expectation as we roll forward here and just make a couple key points. The first is that BC Hydro does expect to acquire 3,000 gigawatt hours through the new energy acquisition process. And what I mean by that is if load is unfolding generally in line with the reference load scenario or higher, that we'd be looking at 3,000 gigawatt hours really as a floor, and then subsequent calls to follow if we are trending towards those higher load scenarios. We do see the scenario in which we acquire less than 3,000 gigawatt hours being quite unlikely and really only triggered in response to significant shifts such as a recession that would really see us being fairly confident that we're going to realize fairly significant downside risks. Otherwise, we think it's important, given the demand that we expect, both looking at the reference and the accelerated electrification load scenario, to send a clear signal to the market that that's what we expect to need and that's what we're going to acquire. The second point I would make, though, is that even with the model that we're proposing to move towards with a living long-term resource plan and more frequent updates, I think it's always incumbent upon us as BC Hydro to work upon the most recent information we have and then to take advantage of whatever processes in front of us to make sure that we apprise the Commission of that most recent information. And so what we won't do is make a decision that is not in the best interests of what we see as being in the best interest of ratepayers. If we do have more recent information that would inform a shift, we'll make that decision.
Yeah, so with respect to your questions around provisions that require and compensate EPA holders for being on hold and or potentially paying them out in the case of a termination initiated by BC Hydro, we have not finalized our terms in our contract. I think at least the provision to reimburse IPPs in the case of BC Hydro initiated termination event, I think existed in prior EPAs. Suffice to say, exercising those options would be highly disruptive to the marketplace. But on the questions of whether or not we are planning to do that, I think it's probably early to make that determination. We are still seeking inputs and feedback from all the bidders and also from folks such as yourself. So we'll take all the feedback under advisement.
Maybe I'll just add one more quick thing. I was trying to find the reference here as I was speaking. BCUCIR 4.156.5 does speak to this issue a bit. And one of the things it talks about, and Frank referenced this earlier when we're talking about that commercial operation date window, is the potential opportunity to stagger in service dates. And so I think that is one area where we'll want to look further and have further engagement, is the opportunities to be more responsive to whatever might be unfolding by looking at how you might stagger in-service dates as we roll forward.
Thank you. One more question about the capacity credit for the evaluation of EPAs. Is it potentially the case that there could be dispatch rights for BC Hydro? So presumably you've got a plant that's got some capacity and is dispatchable, curtailable. That would be very valuable to BC Hydro in terms of running the system. So that there's a button at Control Center that shuts the plant off when BC Hydro is in a surplus situation, or conversely, if there's a problem on the system that the plant has brought up. Is that considered some kind of dispatchability, curtailability?
I think that would be a project-specific request that we have to consider offhand. To the extent that such capability and value exists, I think we'll consider it, absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll try online or MS Teams with Clean Energy BC.
Hi, can you hear me this time?
Yes.
Okay, great. I'll turn my mic on so you won't see me scramble. On slide 40 with the integration cost, is BC Hydro proposing to do this? And you say, part of your objective is cost effectiveness. Is BC Hydro looking at integration cost on an individual project basis, or will you consider, similar to Hydro-Quebec's recent wind RFP, grouping and network costs as subgroups within the procurement?
Our current thinking is integration adjuster will apply on a technology basis, not on a project-specific basis. So any wind project or solar project would be subject to the integration adjuster.
So location, connecting point, and potential upgrades in one area won't be considered. It's just on a total postage stamp basis by technology.
I think those considerations if I understand you correctly, are considered in the interconnection adjuster as opposed to integration adjuster.
Okay. On the interconnection adjuster then, is this done by grouping within the award group is the thought, or each individual project will get assigned its own standalone interconnection costs?
It's a bit of both. On a project-specific basis, there will be a project-specific network upgrade. And so the costs around the upgrades will be incorporated, and that's on a project-specific basis. There will be losses and transmission impacts, which may be done on a regional basis or project-specific basis, but we have not made the final determination on the treatment of those two costs.
Okay. The example and the approach that Hydro-Quebec used, trying to kind of find an objective of lower overall cost to customers, was while let's say you have 3 projects in an award stack, the cheapest project number 1 and the most expensive project number 3 share network facilities, so their overall costs are cheaper than picking 1 and 2, which is 2 different network costs. So just as an example to consider. And I believe it's the previous slide, with respect to curtailment rights, and I believe the previous questions was kind of going along this line. Is BC Hydro's approach full curtailment savings to customers or to proponents participating? Therefore, they're not having to price in some sort of expectation of future curtailment in the BC Hydro system?
Yeah, so for the most part, curtailments initiated by BC Hydro will result in compensation to the IPPs. So they will be kept whole in that scenario. There is another curtailment provision related to transmission system outage, and I think our current thinking is that likely will be a shared risk as opposed to a risk completely borne by BC Hydro.
Okay. Back to interconnection cost, one of the main abilities to drive lower cost effective is the cost that a proponent or IPP would have to uptake. Is BC Hydro considering, to try and help from a cost effectiveness point of view, processes to allow an understanding of what proponent interconnection funding will need it? So think of it as substation or interconnection design on the proponent, or is this kind of standard from your OAT?
So are you asking whether Hydro will support IPP's own transmission infrastructure required to interconnect to BC Hydro?
So visibility into what BC Hydro might require the IPP to install as part of connection, but would be the cost responsibility of the IPP.
Yeah, so IPPs would have full visibility in terms of what the transmission interconnection requirements are in order to connect to the BC Hydro system. And so those standards and requirements are published and publicly made available to bidders. So they should have full visibility in terms of what they have to do to connect to our system.
Okay, even if they're different connection point options, trying to limit both their costs and the total network cost that might be applied to them. Maybe I'll try it. You're a project and you can connect to a line that's close by, but it will drive a much higher network cost, which would be applied to that project as part of your proposal assessment. Or you go to another point farther away, which would have a lower network cost connection, but would necessitate a higher connection cost that the IPP would be fully funding. Is there any process thoughts on this? Just trying to think of it from an overall cost effectiveness point of view.
Yeah, so we are contemplating having a optimization process prior to bid submission, looking at the trade-off between IPP's interconnection costs vis-a-vis BC Hydro's interconnection cost. I think that's what you're referring to.
Yeah, yes.
And so it's not just about different interconnection configuration, but I think the other feedback that we heard was different capacity may drive different interconnection solutions and different interconnection scope and cost, and whether or not opportunity exists for BC Hydro to incorporate that optimization process. And we're still thinking about how we can do that within the procurement schedule that's currently in front of us. I'll just say that in theory that's something that we should pursue and would like to pursue, but we just need to work out how we can implement that in the context of a procurement call. I think, as you imagine, if we have large number of bidders with number of different configurations and potential solution, it becomes really unmanageable and unworkable in the context of a procurement process. So that's the trade-off that we're trying to think through.
I wholeheartedly agree. Last question. You indicate an upper limit of capacity of 200 megawatts. The call is an energy call, the project size capacity, and justification of the 200, you want to spread risk mitigation, so you're not awarding to one big group. Does BC Hydro have a view on the total capacity based on the energy call right now to get to the 200, or was that 200 built up from a project size point of view?
Yeah, so I think from a capacity or conversion to a capacity, our current working number is around 800 to 1,200 megawatts.
Okay. Thank you very much for the time.
Okay, we're going to move to the Association of Major Power Customers.
Thank you. Mr. Lusney's questions have dovetailed well. Just on the 200 megawatt cap, Mr. Lynn, can you elaborate as to why you've got that figure as the cap for projects?
Yeah, as I said earlier, we do want diversity of supplies in our awarded portfolio. So placing upper limit on the project size, as I said in my presentation, allow us to mitigate the scenario where one or two proposals take up the entire call volume. So that's really the rationale behind it.
Okay, that was slide 37. Maybe if we can turn up slide 38. There's a couple things that were raised in Mr. Ince's questions and Mr. Sanvi's response that overlapped with a few questions we wanted to understand better. So the bottom of slide 38 mentions the potential incentives that BC Hydro is considering to accelerate COD if you find yourself, from a load resource balance perspective, caught in a bit of a rush. Can you elaborate on what sort of incentives are being considered?
Yeah, to be honest, we have not landed on the the amount or the type of payments, other than that's a concept that's currently under consideration. And it's within the 3-year COD window, so it's not prior to the fiscal 2029.
And is the risk of a late COD, the risk of a late COD, is that equally a weighting criterion when it comes to which project might be awarded a place in the portfolio?
Currently, that's not our thinking. Currently, any project that can meet our COD window will be eligible, and we're not currently thinking placing additional weighting or value in the evaluation process. And this is where I think incentive payments will come in, is not encouraging project early in service day through evaluation, but through payments under the contract.
Okay. I want to sort of go to the other side of that coin then. I'm mindful of Mr. Sanvi's response about potentially staggering in-service dates under the 3,000 gigawatt hour call for power, the first tranche, if you find yourself with a flat load resource balance. And that staggering was also raised in the response to AMPC IR. It was 4.5.7. Can you give us some insight into, and this was filed, I think, August 11th. Can you give us some insight into what conditions BC Hydro is considering to facilitate that staggering as part of that first call for power?
Can you provide the IR response reference again?
.7.6. And that makes reference to BCUC IR 1.156.5 and 156.3. But I think the point is the same. If you find yourself with a changed load resource balance, BC Hydro said on August 11th, there's the potential to stagger the COD dates. And I'm wondering, since that time, what is your current thinking, and what might we expect to see when that tranche is finalized?
I think that when you expect to see is really in November timeframe when we will develop further thinking around that particular topic. I think with the COD window, I think we're expecting to have diversity of project proposing to deliver energy during that 3-year window, and it's up to BC Hydro then to decide how we better manage that risk. So but in terms of the timing, November is the time that we're proposed to come up with additional details on how we plan to evaluate projects.
Okay, so nothing to share with us until November.
That's correct.
And just to piggyback on the sequence of questions about, I'll try and get this microphone figured out. If we can piggyback on the questions about storage, is BC Hydro contemplating building any sort of storage as part of its new energy acquisitions? Not necessarily the call for power, but adding capacity going forward. Is BC Hydro contemplating building itself any sort of storage, battery or otherwise?
So the short answer is yes. As part of our near-term actions in the IRP, we've identified that we will be doing pilots on utility-scale batteries, and which we are currently doing, and that would get us prepared to build utility-scale batteries should the need unfold.
BCOAPO.
Irina Miss, earlier you mentioned that you use the most recent information for your decisions. And given that the call for new energy is expected to be issued in the spring of 2024, will another update to the IRP or the load and resource balances be prepared before then?
Short answer is no. So as I mentioned earlier, our expectation is to acquire the 3,000 gigawatt hours. We wouldn't see us acquiring less than that unless there's a fairly significant downside event such as a recession. So based on where we see ourselves today, the update as recent as June in terms of the load scenarios, we think 3,000 is a balanced position, and that's what we intend to go for, short of, as I say, a significant downside event occurring.
And another question, can you comment on the statement that any mechanism that creates flexibility for BC Hydro in terms of timing and size of the acquisition is likely to increase the price of the acquisition power, of the acquired power?
Do you have a specific reference where that statement is being
No,
made? Or?
This is like my hypothetical for you. What would be your comment on this statement?
Are you referring to timing and the volume, the unpredictability around those two parameters and which drive up prices? Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, I'm referring to BC Hydro's flexibility in terms of timing and size of acquisition.
Sure. So one feedback that we've heard repeatedly from IPPs is, I mean, there's a lot of competition for capital and corporate interest for renewable power, right? It's quite extensive, and in terms of interest in North America. And what we have heard is the need to provide strong signals and visibility to the marketplace, which will help them to de-risk in terms of their ability and desire to invest in BC. If the premise that we need a series of power going forward is correct, we do need to send those strong signal and visibility to the market. So I would suggest that having those risk removed from the marketplace should result in lower bid prices for BC Hydro.
And one more question, maybe it's on the record. I apologize if I'm asking something again, but will the results of these calls for new energy be used to reset the reference price for the long-run marginal cost of energy?
And the short answer to that is yes. As we gain new information about about the cost of the resources available to us, we will reflect that, and it will be reflected in the updated long-run marginal costs in future IRBs.
Okay, a couple more questions in the hearing room before we go back online. Next is Linda Dong, Zone 2 ratepayers.
Hi, I have a couple of questions regarding slide 36. It's on the economic participation models for First Nations. I was just wondering. Oh, okay. Is BC Hydro considering a minimum percentage of First Nations ownership and/or economic benefits?
We are anticipating a minimum level. Exactly what that is has not been finalized yet.
Oh, okay. So will that be coming out of the consultations that you're having?
Yes, we're seeking inputs in terms of the option as well as the level. And then based on all the inputs I receive, we'll develop I would say, preferred option for further engagements in November.
And how will that criteria prioritize or be ranked in terms of the assessment of the project in the upcoming RFP?
Yeah, to be honest, I don't have a good answer for you at this point in time because we haven't landed on which approach that we're going to proceed with, and that will determine whether or not it's non-price consideration or it's a price consideration with the sort of minimum eligibility requirement. So there's still quite a bit of uncertainty in terms of which option we're going to be proceeding with.
Okay. Another question I have is on slide 37. This one talks about the eligibility requirements going forward. The question I had is regarding project location. In the discussions we've had, BC Hydro's is intent on purchasing cost-effective power for its customers. However, you have this constraint that projects must be located in BC and be able to deliver energy to the BC Hydro integrated system. I'm wondering if you have looked at what the premium or discount is for projects located outside BC and bring it into the BC Hydro system. For example, projects located in Western Canada or in the Pacific Northwest, or from above.
Ms. Nong, I think the short answer there is that that's really not an option available to us to contemplate, given the self-sufficiency legislation, which requires that the resources we're acquiring to meet need are from within British Columbia.
Okay, thanks. The other question I had was regarding resources for this call. Has BC Hydro brought in any additional resources to manage this call? And if not, will this have any impact on other BC Hydro activities that they're trying to prioritize going forward?
Resources to manage which aspect of?
Well, all aspects of the call. Like, are you outsourcing any of the activities, or you're bringing in more contractors, et cetera?
Yeah, so we have developed a budget that will take us through to the completion of this call process. And we are intending to use a combination of outside resources and internal resources to support the call. And so we are treating this as a priority, there's no question about it. In terms of the impact to other initiatives, I am not anticipating that right now, because I think we have the ability to bring additional resources as needed.
And because of the additional costs for the call that wasn't anticipated when the fiscal 23-25 revenue requirements were developed, will this mean that we'll be out of plan, or how will these costs be managed?
Yeah, so with regards to the various staff and contractor resources that are being brought to bear that Mr. Lin mentioned, those are cost pressures that BC Hydro will need to manage within the existing envelope. The rates for fiscal 2023 to fiscal 2025 were set, as you mentioned, Ms. Dong, through the revenue requirements application, and we're not looking to go back to the Commission to reopen that, and so to the extent that there are incremental costs that we can't manage within the approved envelope, those will be to the account of government as a shareholder or needing to be managed by BC Hydro through internal budgets.
Okay, those are my questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Steve Davies?
Yes, Steve Davis with the BC Solar and Storage Industries Association. My question is about essentially encouraging diversity of supply across, I'll call it fuel types. And earlier today, I think Mr. D'Souza mentioned that the dominant form of generation in BC comes from hydro sources. I think you mentioned 85% or something like that. And Commissioner Brewer raised the issue about the risk of droughts and climate change. BC currently has no utility-scale solar generation or indeed geothermal generation. Adding solar generation would diversify BC's sources of supply, essentially adding energy from solar irradiance to energy largely from precipitation. There is a direct and essentially inverse correlation between years of drought or low precipitation and years of high solar irradiance. So adding solar would provide a system benefit of diversity of supply source. So my question to you, Mr. Lin, is there something in the terms or adjusters in the EPA that reveals the benefit of diversity of supply source, especially things like solar?
I would say the way that we're designing the call is to acquire energy with attributes that are meeting the needs of our system. We're somewhat agnostic as to what technology that we get, provided that they're clean, renewable, and they offer cost-effective supplies and attractive attributes. Solar with battery definitely will be able to receive capacity credit, and so from that standpoint, they will be welcomed by this procurement process. But there's no specific credits that will be applied to solar or any other technology for that matter.
Okay, Capital Power, Mark Davis.
Matt Davis, Capital Power. Going back to the capacity credit, utility scale batteries are viewed as the marginal capacity resource. Will the capacity credit be based on that?
Yeah, that's our current expectation, is to price capacity off of that, yes.
Thank you. And just a follow-up question. With the capacity that does get procured through the energy acquisition process, will BC Hydro then be adjusting its needs for capacity in the future on a go-forward basis in its, I guess, the living IRP?
Yes, any capacity that comes with the resources that we acquire as part of the 3,000 gigawatt hour call for greenfield energy or the 700 gigawatt hours will be reflected in our load resource balances in the future once they are acquired.
And do you have an estimate of what amount of capacity that will be?
So that would really depend on the nature of the resources that are what successfully get a contract with. So yes, I mean that's a short answer.
Okay, the outer edges of my memory are really being tested here, so you have to introduce yourself before you speak.
Melissa Davies with the Association of Major Power Customers. More generally, on slide 40 for the financial adjusters, I feel like, and granted I haven't read every page in this proceeding, but I feel like these adjusters this slide is the first time that we've kind of heard of these financial adjusters in your call for power plan. I was wondering if you'd be willing to provide an undertaking that kind of details the framework for establishing them in a bit more detail on what cost certainties and risks you're trying to mitigate with them. Like especially, for example, you said you're looking at a $2 per megawatt hour one of the costs I think was around that, and I'm wondering how you developed that, what it means in relation to the total price, how that could impact ratepayers, that sort of thing.
I think our initial suggestion might be that the need of that undertaking and perhaps others like it is best considered through the submissions that the Commission has asked for on Friday. As I said, BC Hydro's position is that there's really what's capable of being determined in this proceeding without a significant lengthening to it would be volume and timing. And as Mr. Linds talked about, I think a lot of the details in this presentation, this represents what we know today, but also what we know will change as we go forward and get more input. And so I think our position would be that the absent a change to the trajectory and length of this proceeding, I'm not sure that information would add additional value here.
Okay. I mean, I won't fight you on that, but in terms of cost, in terms of your cost effectiveness approach and trying to understand ratepayer implications, I respectfully disagree, but okay. I just have one other question then that it's more on slide 38, so the fixed price, contract price that you have here. Just trying to understand, in terms of your cost-effective approach in your call for power, do you kind of foresee taking in these fixed price bids and just, stacking up the lowest cost ones and accepting those? Is that kind of the overall intention? Because I just heard you say something about non-price considerations, so I wanted to get some clarity on that.
Yeah, so maybe I can address your first question or request first. So what you're seeing today is what we have developed so far.
Mm-hmm.
As I said in my presentation, we are planning to go out again in November, which will set out the overall evaluation approach, and we'll be able to provide additional details around the adjusters and how they are used. So maybe we could have or be able to provide you more information around that time frame.
Just to clarify, my understanding of that November and January is that it's your engagement process and not necessarily within the regulatory forum?
Correct. That's correct.
Okay. Okay. And then I guess I'll just follow up then that is it your understanding that that fixed price, contract price was going to kind of compare to that market price that you're looking at for the EPAs up to 2026 renewals? So from shifting from that market market-based price model to that fixed price-based model, is that going to shift the financial risk onto ratepayers more?
So, again, we have not landed on the final evaluation approach and whether it's just stacking up the prices or is it a portfolio approach with non-price consideration. We're not there yet.
Okay.
Historically, what we have done, and that you can maybe consider as a good as a potential outcome of our evaluation deliberation, is we take the bid price that we receive from bidders and then add adjuster to it, right? And the adjusted bid price, as we call them, basically representing the total cost or total impact to BC Hydro. And so we then take the bid price, add it, the adjusters, and then start to stack them up, and then we buy up to the target volume contemplated by the procurement. And so that was what was done in the past. It is possible we proceed with a similar approach, but we just haven't landed on a final decision one way or the other.
Okay. And then for the 700 gigawatt hours of EPA new EPA renewals, have you landed on an approach there?
We'll just clarify, so these wouldn't be electricity purchase agreement renewals in the way that I think we've used that term, where we're renewing existing arrangements. It's existing facilities where we're aware of energy that's being produced today, but not for BC Hydro. So just to distinguish there, and the pricing there, we expect would be the product of bilateral negotiations.
So that market-based pricing that you're doing for the current renewals, kind of extending that, or?
I think I would hesitate to characterize it, just that in the sense that, as I say, I think the way that number was arrived at was BC Hydro's awareness of some opportunities that we're intending to pursue. And so we're going to pursue those opportunities. We're going to have conversations with proponents about what pricing would be necessary to secure that opportunity. If we believe that price is cost effective relative to the greenfield supply options, we would pursue it. But I would hesitate to be too prescriptive about it, really, because it will be an outcome of those conversations with those proponents.
Okay. And I guess just because it's a workshop, this isn't a question as much as it is a statement, but in general, we found in the past with regulatory proceedings and trying to understand cost of energies details, the transparency between IPB, EPA costs versus BC Hydro built costs is quite expansive. So just, moving forward to the extent that you can provide the transparency possible in these EPA negotiations, that in terms of ratepayer impacts and cost considerations that we haven't quite seen in the past, that would be extremely helpful.
Sure. No, I appreciate the feedback, and we'll take that away as something to consider as we go forward.
Okay. Michael, did you have another question?
I think just dovetailing with the questions Melissa just asked, you've mentioned a few times the importance of cost effectiveness really being driven by the market response. And my question was just, what safeguards is BC Hydro planning to have to ensure that the bid process actually results in a competitive selection of bidders given the conditions attaching to the process?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I fully understand your question.
Maybe put another way, what if, given the conditions BC Hydro is attaching to the procurement process, there's only a select number of bidders as opposed to a full market response? Is BC Hydro anticipating any safeguards to address deficiencies in the bid response?
Yeah, well, there's a reason we have started engagement process in June, and that would take us really to the end of this year, is we want to make sure the conditions that we attach to the procurement are not adverse from a market reaction standpoint. So, and on top of that, we are and have been doing jurisdictional benchmark against other jurisdictions to make sure that our conditions, our procurement conditions, both in the RFP and on the contract, are reasonable and market, right? So that's one thing that we're doing in terms of very extensive due diligence and engagements, just to make sure we don't have that scenario.
And I guess just to follow up, despite best intentions, sometimes you design a process around expecting a market outcome and you don't always get it. Is BC Hydro anticipating creating any sort of safeguards to protect against that outcome?
You mean provision in the procurement document that allows Hydro to change its view depending on market response?
That's an example, yeah.
Yeah. I believe conditions like that exist in prior BC Hydro procurement process. And again, we have not finalized the procurement documents, but it is something that we likely will consider as well.
Okay, and then I guess just one follow-up on that. Would BC Hydro consider building some of this infrastructure itself if it doesn't get the market response it expects?
So the type of generation projects that we're targeting are likely solar, wind, let's say biomass, and maybe geothermal, right? If we can get them, that would be a great outcome. And I would say hydro simply is not, or does not have the sort of the competency to be leading development of those type of projects. So our default position is still we're going to look to market to help bring those projects online for BC Hydro.
And I think this ties in with the question that Melissa asked earlier, but will BC Hydro be able to provide transparency as part of future regulatory processes about the relative cost to build if it were undertaking these projects itself relative to the price it obtains in the market?
I think maybe I'll just make 2 quick points. I think number one, again, appreciate the feedback, and I think we can think about how we'll incorporate that. I guess my second thought, though, would be we'd have to consider how you might come up with that proxy if BC Hydro hasn't been developing these projects. I think one issue that's always been canvassed in similar proceedings has been cost of capital of hydro relative to other proceedings. So that's certainly an angle that could get some consideration. But in terms of what would it actually cost BC Hydro if BC Hydro were doing the work, given that we haven't done it, I'm not sure that there may be a limit to how much granularity there could be there.
Okay, thank you. Those are my questions.
Okay, we'll move online, and apologies if I butcher your name. Mine gets butchered all the time, so I can just offer sympathy. Cal Liam?
Solar Coalition. On slide 15, you talk about your process looking at limiting land and water impacts. This bodes well for rooftop solar, but I'm unaware of any rooftops with the 50 megawatt capacity. Have you considered aggregating rooftops by any chance?
Yeah, so Shell, I think the issue you're raising is really, the concept of customer-based generation versus more utility scale generation. And so one of the things that we've said is that we want that to be an area of focus for the next long-term resource plan. In this particular 2021 integrated resource plan, we did do an analysis on the relative cost effectiveness of offering incentives to net metering customers to customer-based generation and looking at the cost of that relative to more utility scale options. We found that generally was not cost effective, and so it's not something that we're looking to pursue as part of this particular energy acquisition. That said, the reason we want to have it as an area of focus in the next long-term resource plan is that we recognize, I think, a few things. One is the strong customer interest in that area, wanting to encourage and support that. 2 is that costs continue to change. We want to make sure that we're considering the most recent cost information. And 3 is that as we go into acquiring more and more utility scale projects, then customer generation, I think, really does become the next tranche of resources that perhaps needs to get looked at. And so want to make sure we explore that as we go into next long-term resource plans, but not part of this particular acquisition process we're talking about here today.
When are you thinking the next resource plan will take place?
So our submission, and of course, ultimately the commission will be the one to determine when they would like to see the next plan from BC Hydro, but our submission is detailed in section 7 of Exhibit B39, the signpost update, is that we would bring forward the next long-term resource plan as part of this living cycle 18 months following the commission's decision in this proceeding.
Thank you.
Are those your questions, Shell? Yeah, okay. So we'll move to BCUC staff before turning it back to the panel. Sorry, some others after.
Thank you. Good morning. Charlene DeBoer with BCUC staff. A couple of further follow-up questions regarding slide 40 and the financial adjustments that BC Hydro is contemplating. Regarding the capacity credit, could you please elaborate on whether this credit would be available or location-based in any way? For example, would the credit be limited to areas where BC Hydro has identified a capacity shortfall over the planning horizon? Or would it be available on the same basis for resources of a particular type, regardless of where they're located?
So our current thinking is the capacity credit is a system capacity credit. It's not a regional capacity credit. As I mentioned earlier, there may be opportunities for us to identify localized regional capacity through our interconnection studies, but it won't be done as a blanket adjustment in our evaluation. The way we're thinking about capacity credit is only applicable or available to those technologies that are able to offer capacity, right? So it's not a bidding strategy per se, but it has to come from generation technologies such as biomass, geothermal, and others. So does that answer your question?
So in the signpost update in the IRP, BC Hydro has identified specific subregions within the province that have a capacity deficit over the planning horizon. And am I correct to understand that that factor would not be a consideration in the adjustments you're looking at in the call for power?
That's correct. That's our current thinking on that, yes.
Thank you. And my second clarification relates to the interconnection cost adjuster and is a follow-up on a question posed by Mr. Lesney earlier this morning. In response to BCUC IR 4.169.3, BC Hydro had stated that it expects the call design will consider parameters to avoid triggering major network upgrades and to provide guidance to potential applicants regarding the connection capability of relevant regions of the BC Hydro grid. Am I correct to understand the discussion this morning is that BC Hydro is still considering whether such signals will be included in the interconnection adjuster, and if so, how?
Yeah, so as I said in my presentation, we are planning to produce and provide additional system information related to transmission capacity in November. So the idea around that information is to identify potential areas of constraints, and so that bidders would have the ability to better assess their projects. Through the feasibility studies that we will be doing, we will identify project-specific network upgrades. And so with the way the adjuster work, those projects that have higher transmission or interconnection adjuster because they have higher network upgrades will be disadvantaged, so to speak, in our evaluation. So that's how we consider the interconnection impact through the selection process.
So would it be fair to paraphrase that as on kind of the portfolio level, it's a signal or an FYI to bidders about the various regions of the province that may have restrictions, but the actual adjusters would be on a project-specific basis and their own specific network upgrades?
That's correct, except for losses. And like I said, there's a bulk system transmission adjustment that may be done on a regional basis as opposed to a project-specific basis. But with respect to interconnection costs or network upgrades, they will be project-specific, and they will be used, the project-specific information will be used in evaluation.
Thank you.
Okay, to the Nutchalnuth Tribal Council.
David Austin. Earlier in one of the conversations I was having with the BC Hydro panel, I made a reference to BC Hydro's 2022/23 annual service plan report, and this was in relation to an adjustment to market price, and it can be found at page 40 of that document. And in short, it says average market energy prices of US $83.40 per megawatt hour. And I said it was in the range of, I think, about $90 US per megawatt hour. And I'd like to turn your attention to slide 37. And on slide 37, it says eligible project size 30 to 50 megawatt minimum. And I was wondering if BC Hydro would reconsider that in relation to First Nation owned and developed projects, because a 30 to 50 megawatt minimum is an awfully high bar for a First Nation that will have to find both the equity and the debt for that type of project. So it would be very helpful if that bar were lowered so that First Nations might have an opportunity to successfully bid in projects. And the question that comes from that is, how is the 30 to 50 megawatt minimum set?
So there are a few questions there. So with respect to lowering minimum project size, I think as I said in my presentation, we want to take advantage of economies of scale. And based on our jurisdictional analysis and see the outcome of procurements from other provinces, there's a convergence that the project that end up getting contract tend to be north of 50 megawatt. And I think that's when the economies of scale start to kick in. With respect to lowering project size in order for First Nation to participate and raise the necessary money, I think that is a real issue, and that is a feedback that we've heard repeatedly. And I think from BC Hydro's standpoint, we think the solution to that is to facilitate and help nations find additional sources of capital. And so to that end, we are in discussions with the Canadian Infrastructure Bank to see if there's opportunity for them to step in and be that financier for some of the First Nation capital requirements. We also are raising this issue to our government to see if there's opportunity there. So, and I don't think the solution is necessarily just to lower the project size, because I think there's a benefit of having larger project size for reasons I cited, economies of scale, and also I think it would help us manage the number of interconnection requests and also a number of proposals that we had to evaluate in our procurement process.
Well, I appreciate your concerns. You really don't know whether the economies of scales exist until you have an RFP to find out. Isn't that correct?
Yeah, of course. But like I said, I think there's enough data points in other jurisdictions to provide fairly good indication as when economies of scale will start to trigger.
And since we're having a conversation, and this is not a formal hearing of any sorts, it's one thing to talk about the ability to raise the capital, but when you're looking at projects in the size of 30 to 50 megawatts, the First Nations have to have the capacity to be able to execute those projects. So I think it would be fair to say that it's easier to execute in relation to the development and construction of a smaller size project for some First Nations than it would be to execute, including construction at the 30 to 50 megawatt limit. Any comment on that?
Is your question whether it's easier to develop a small project than a larger project?
Sure, if you're a First Nation and you've got limited capacity in terms of management and knowledge in terms of projects.
I guess the capital requirement is different. I agree, but I mean, I'm not sure I would necessarily equate complexity or correlate complexity with project size per se. I'm sure each project, regardless of size, has its own unique set of issues that you have to manage through. So.
Well, certainly, but there's also the question of risk, isn't there?
Yes. Yes, but most of these projects are going to be financed on a non-recourse basis, right? So each project will need to stand on its own in terms of risk mitigations and risk exposure.
No, I appreciate that in terms of the financing aspect of it, but there's also the ability to actually obtain financing, and suppose we have that, then there's the question of being able to actually build the project, and having the capacity and know-how to build a smaller project is not the same as the capacity and know-how required to build a larger project, because with a larger project and capacity comes more risk to the First Nation.
I think maybe just to to cut to the chase a bit, Mr. Austin, and summarize, I mean, I think you're highlighting some of the trade-offs around the issue of minimum project size. You have economies of scale on the one hand, you have ability to undertake projects and complexity and risk on the other. As Mr. Lynn mentioned, I think it's an issue we're continuing to take feedback on, but I think the way I would perhaps summarize it overall is to your point of, well, why not just let the bid? I think an important part of this as well is being transparent and setting expectations. And so there is, I think, a desire on BC Hydro's side to, where we can and where we think it makes sense, to be clear about the parameters that we put in place so that we don't unfairly create an expectation or a hope that isn't there. But as I said, I think you're highlighting some trade-offs, and those are ones we'll take feedback on, but I would go back to what Mr. Lynn said in terms of economies of scale being a significant driver, given our desire to get cost-effective pricing.
And maybe just to add to that point, it's my understanding that the province, through the new relationship trust, is developing a program that's more targeted towards small Indigenous-led projects. And so I think there are multiple avenues the First Nation, with their smaller project, can participate in the acquisition process.
On that same slide, on the next bullet, it says projects must be capable of achieving its COD between fall 2028 and fall 2031. Has BC Hydro taken into considerations the lead times that are now developing for basic electrical equipment? And maybe to put this into context, last week we heard through the oral hearing process that utilities are scaling up their demand forecasts, and they're now more in the range of about 3.5%. In my experience dealing with generating projects that are being developed outside of British Columbia, it's become increasingly clear that the lead times associated with ordering basic electrical equipment are going up. And for the purposes of setting these dates, has BC Hydro taken into consideration the difficulties that might be accruing when people go into the market to order basic electrical equipment? At the same time, many utilities across the United States and Canada are going into the market to order the same equipment for the purposes of improving their systems for the purposes of a 3.5% increasing load.
Yeah, so supply chain constraints and the lead time for electrical equipment are definitely something that we're very much aware of, and trying to get feedback from stakeholders and IPPs and First Nations. Again, if I look at our current schedule, we have allowed from 4 to 7 years after contract award to allow project to bring their projects online. And to the extent that we get additional feedback about that schedule, we'll make further adjustments. But our current best estimation is that that is sufficient to bring the projects online within that time frame.
In one of your responses to another question during this workshop, you indicated that BC Hydro was benchmarking its terms and conditions for its RFP against other utilities. Could you assist us by providing the names of some of those other utilities so that we can look at what their RFP processes are or are like?
Sure. We've looked at Hydro-Quebec, we've looked at ASO, we've looked at Ontario, we've looked at Nova Scotia, and we've looked at SAS Power. Those are just a few names that I can remember off the top of my head.
Would you be able to provide, just in the form of an email or something, it's not an undertaking, the names of some of the other RFPs you've been looking at?
You mean the list that I just provided?
Yes.
I think the transcripts. I think we think those references are probably generally representative and sufficient on the transcript, Mr. Austin.
Thank you.
Mr. Davies?
Yeah, Steve Davis with the BC Solar and Storage Association. Just like some more clarification on essentially the locational credit adjusters. In the past call, there was, as I recall, two metrics. One was essentially a locational credit based on transmission losses, typically from wherever the project was down to the Lower Mainland. But there was a second adjuster, which was called SIFT, which stood for the cost of incremental firm transmission. I don't see any indication of SIFT being included as an adjuster in this call. So my question is, will it be included, and perhaps if not, why not? What's changed?
Yeah, so as I said earlier, we are expecting to include further adjustments to account for losses and other transmission impacts. That's my shorthand way of saying SIFT. But the reason I choose not to use that terminology is because we are still contemplating whether or not that's the right approach, and if so, what is the appropriate amount. So more details to come.
Unless there are any questions online, I think that concludes it for questions from the hearing room and online. So to the panel.
I don't think we have questions, but I have one question. So some of the questions have talked about sort of here's the project, solar or whatever. I'm learning more and more that projects bidding and being approved, at least some data I've seen from Lawrence Berkeley Lab in North America, it's no need to know the source, shows these hybrid projects where they're actually matching some storage with the variable renewable. And so is that something that could bid into you as well? And would you treat it as an individual bid, which then has the extra value on the capacity side? Or I'm just trying to figure out how you would deal with a hybrid bid like that.
Yeah, so that configuration is most likely eligible, and I say most likely just because we haven't finalized the terms and conditions of the process. But based on our current thinking, we would treat that as a cluster, so not individual project, but as a single bid.
Right.
And where that gets evaluated is the fact that because of the storage and firming ability and potentially capacity credit, they will be favored through the sort of the 2x12 table that I talked about, as well as the addition of capacity credit.
Yep. Okay. Thank you. So I think we're done with questions. Mr. Austin, we had your questions. You got just one more? Okay.
That's because you asked the question.
Yeah, no, but I get to do the last question, Mr. Austin.
You certainly can do that. In terms of the previous discussion I had, that I'm just trying to sort out how, for the purpose of this call, BC Hydro is using storage, because storage is a battery. So Chairman Jacquard was talking about the concept of battery associated with the generation, and I'm trying to sort out how projects that are bid into the call will be evaluated or associated with the existing storage in the form of hydro storage, which is a battery.
But I think I already heard that question. And anyway, go ahead, answer it again. How are you treating the existing hydro storage? But please be brief.
Well, I think my answer still is the same. To the extent that the addition of new storage results in new energy, which is to be acquired under this call process, then they might be eligible, but to the extent they don't, other than to provide firming and shaping service to existing assets, then my best answer is no, they would not be eligible for this call.
Thank you. So I think this is very convenient, Mr. Basoli, because we're right at noon, and I understand there's a general feeling of taking an hour break at this time. Is that?
Yes, that was my understanding with BC Hydro, or are you done the presentation? Or? I think they're Here, I'll give it to Mr. Webb, and he can answer that for you.
And subject to any comments from Mr. Sanvi, I believe BC Hydro has completed its presentation.
Okay. Correct. Okay, sorry, I didn't understand. I thought there was another group of you to be up here this afternoon. This is great.
This was a support crew, so.
Right. Well then, so I understand, do you want to make any final comments here to end
Sure,
your
thank you.
workshop?
Just very briefly, just to say thank you. I think it was a helpful morning, and on many of the topics raised, look forward to further discussion and appreciate the interest. Thank you.
Okay, so I, or anyone I guess, can say that this workshop's now over, and thank everyone for participating. Thank you very much, BC Hydro, and all the participants. Thank you.
I'll unplug us all. Thank you.
Nobody liked my jokes.
Sorry?
Nobody liked my jokes.